Ink and Cinnamon. A Grumpy Sunshine Anonymous Pen Pal Romance. By Roxy Winterfield. Copyright 2026 by Roxy Winterfield. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced or transmitted in any form or any means, electronic or mechanical, including photocopying, recording or any information storage or retrieval system, without authorization in writing provided by the publisher. This story is a work of fiction. The persons, places, things, and otherwise animate or inanimate objects mentioned in this novel are figments of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to anything or anyone living or dead is unintentional.
Chapter 1. 3 weeks before Christmas, the snow came down in fat, meandering flakes, the kind that looked soft enough to catch in your palm and hold there forever. Pippa Hawthorne watched them drift past the train window, each one a perfect moment nobody asked for, and she wondered if that meant anything about her own situation. A soft, unasked-for thing landing in a place it wasn't meant to be. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and sighed, fogging it with her breath. Oakhaven appeared through the white. The church steeple first, then the peaked roofs of Main Street buildings dusted white like wedding cake. Beyond that, the skeletal trees and snow-laden pines that ringed the town in their perpetual embrace. It was exactly as she remembered, which made everything worse. The layoff notification had come on a Tuesday in November, which Pippa now understood was a cowardly day of the week for terrible news. Corporate restructuring, they'd called it. Efficiency optimization. They'd said it wasn't personal, which was the most personal thing anyone could say. She'd spent 4 years in the event planning department of Stratton & Associates, 4 years building elaborate galas and corporate retreats, 4 years believing she'd found her place in the world. Then they'd found her dispensable, and she was back on a train heading home with 2 boxes of belongings and a severance package that wouldn't stretch far. Her mother had insisted on the visit home. Just for the holidays, she'd said, which was code for you need your family, and your dignity is less important than your emotional well-being. Her parents were in Florida now, living their retirement dream in a development called Sunshine Villas that Pippa suspected was slowly sinking into a swamp. They'd offered to buy her a plane ticket down there, but Pippa had chosen Oakhaven instead, chosen the house that had been sitting empty since Grandmother Hawthorne passed last spring. The taxi pulled up to Hawthorne House and Pippa's breath caught in her throat. The 2-story Victorian was just as she'd left it, but smaller, as if grief had compressed it. The covered porch stretched across the front, and the deep eaves sheltered twin rocking chairs she and her grandmother had sat in countless times, watching the snow, discussing everything from the meaning of true love to the proper ratio of vanilla to nutmeg and sugar cookies. She paid the driver, hauled her bags up the porch steps, and unlocked the front door. The smell hit her first, vanilla and cinnamon, as if her grandmother had been baking just this morning and would shuffle out from the kitchen any moment with flour dusting her cardigan, and a smile that made the whole world seem worth something. But the house was cold and waiting. Pippa set down her bags and allowed herself exactly 90 seconds of standing in the foyer, letting the weight of everything, the layoff, the failure, the return, press down on her shoulders. 90 seconds was what her therapist had recommended for emotional processing. She pulled off her mittens, squared her shoulders, and decided that standing still was a waste of good daylight. She spent the afternoon lighting fires in the downstairs, hauling blankets from the linen closet, running the tap until the pipes remembered how to deliver hot water. By evening the kitchen glowed with heat. She'd found her grandmother's tea kettle, boiled water, and sat at the scarred butcher block island with a cup of Earl Grey, staring at the cabinet where the recipe box lived. It was walnut wood, beautifully made with dovetail joints that someone, maybe her great-grandfather, had constructed with precision. The lid was slightly warped from decades of humidity changes, and the brass latch gleamed from years of her grandmother's polishing. Inside were hundreds of recipe cards written in her flowing script, some dating back to the 1970s, all bearing stains of butter, cocoa, cinnamon, vanilla, the essential ingredients of her grandmother's life. Pippa pulled out a card at random. Her grandmother's handwriting filled it entirely, not just the recipe but little notes in the margins. Use only unsalted butter, the salt matters. Double the extract when you're feeling sad. I don't know why, but it works. This made Henry propose the first time I baked it. Make it whenever you need someone to stay. She traced her finger over the last line. Gingerbread, apparently. Very practical advice from a woman who'd been married 53 years. The next morning, Pippa bundled into her teal chunky knit sweater and boots and made her way into town. The sun had burned off most of the snow, leaving crystalline late November slush beneath her feet. Main Street was strung with garlands, and enormous paper snowflakes hung from the street lamps. The town was midway through its winter festival preparations, and the energy was subdued. Candlewick Commons, which should have been bustling, felt melancholy. The Christmas market was open, yes, with a dozen vendors huddled in booths wrapped in blankets and determined cheer. But the crowd of shoppers was thin. An older man sold hand-knitted scarves that no one seemed to want. A young woman arranged pressed flower ornaments, with the precision of someone trying very hard to make something beautiful matter. Near the gazebo, the town's annual tree stood partially decorated, waiting. It was the loneliness that struck Pippa most, not the loneliness of Oakhaven as a whole, though she'd noticed the vacant storefronts, the restaurants that had closed, the general air of a town still recovering from the mill closure 15 years ago. It was the loneliness in the faces of her neighbors. Mrs. Reed shuffled past carrying shopping bags, her mouth set in a line that suggested she was completing a task, rather than enjoying an outing. The Morrison twins, once inseparable friends, now stood on opposite sides of the commons, each pretending not to see the other. Old Mr. Hendricks sat on a bench despite the cold, feeding breadcrumbs to birds with the devotion of someone who'd run out of other meaningful activities. And Pippa, effusive, earnest, unable to help herself, felt the ache of it in her ribs. All these people in a town full of history and community and shared memory, and yet each of them seemed trapped in their own private winter. She wandered to the gazebo and stood on its white octagonal platform, turning slowly to take in the whole commons. The wrought iron lampposts glowed golden even in daylight, their warmth somehow accusatory, as if they were trying very hard and nobody was appreciating it. Near the gazebo stood the Winter Wishes mailbox, an ornate freestanding structure tainted deep green with gold trim, waiting for letters from Oakhaven residents hoping to connect with anonymous pen pals over the next 3 weeks. Pippa knew about the Winter Wishes letter exchange. Every Oakhaven resident knew about it. The retired postmistress Anya Solberg organized it every year, and the rules were strict. Anonymity was paramount, no names, no identifying details, no attempting to discover your partner's identity before Christmas Eve when the reveal would happen at the tree lighting ceremony. It was oddly romantic and oddly formal, very Oakhaven actually. The town prized authenticity, quiet support, shared history. They showed rather than told, and they were deeply suspicious of anything performative. But what struck Pippa standing there watching people hurry past with their heads down was that someone, a lot of someones, had signed up for the exchange. Despite the quiet melancholy, despite the sense of disconnection, people still hoped for connection. They still wrote letters to strangers. They still believed in small miracles. She walked home slowly, her mind doing that thing it did, leaping from observation to brainstorming, churning through possibilities, thoughts cascading like water over rocks. By the time she reached Hawthorne House, her decision was made. Pippa didn't think carefully about important decisions. She committed to them all at once, the way she did most things, entirely. She would open a pop-up bakery. Just for the season, just for December. She had her grandmother's recipes, she had the kitchen, she had the muscle memory to fold butter into dough, to coax vanilla beans into their sweetest surrender, to measure out comfort in flour and sugar and love. The mistletoe mixer, that's what she'd call it. People needed sweetness right now, literal and figurative. But that wasn't quite enough, was it? Opening a bakery would give her purpose, would channel her energy and her desperate need to feel useful again after the layoff had hollowed out her sense of self. But it wouldn't address what she'd seen in Candlewick Commons. It wouldn't help Mr. Hendricks stop being so alone on that bench, wouldn't help Mrs. Reed remember that shopping could be an experience rather than a task, wouldn't bridge the distance between the Morrison twins. So Pippa added another layer to her plan, enthusiastically, with energy that might have warned a more cautious person. She would include a matchmaking service. Not romantic, necessarily. Not just that. People connecting with people. A bakery where neighbors could come for cookies and hot chocolate, and be introduced to each other in the way small towns used to do, in the way that had been lost somewhere between the mill closure and now. It was ambitious. It was possibly naive. It was definitely a bit much. Even Pippa recognized that she was trying to fix a town's loneliness while she herself felt untethered and broken. But the part of her that had always been a bulldozer with good intentions was already running calculations about how many dozens of cookies she could produce daily, what her profit margins might be, whether the sunroom could serve as a small tea parlor. That evening she pulled on her mustard yellow coat, oversized like being hugged by a pumpkin, and walked back into town. The commons looked different in the dark, the golden lamp light softening everything, making the holidays feel less ironic and more enchanting. The winter wishes mailbox gleamed green and gold, and Pippa approached it like an oracle. She'd brought paper from her grandmother's desk, had written her name in careful letters. Just her first name, the rules allowed that much. Just Pippa from Oakhaven, hoping for connection. Hoping for something that felt like possibility, rather than failure. She pulled open the mailbox door, and the hinges creaked. Inside, dozens of envelopes already waited. White ones, colored ones, some decorated with stickers and drawings, and the desperate hope of people trying to reach across the distance that living in the same town somehow couldn't bridge. Pippa added her envelope to the pile. She didn't know what she was hoping for from the winter wishes letter exchange, certainly not romance, though her grandmother's note about gingerbread and proposals suggested the program had romantic potential. She was hoping for something quieter. Companionship maybe. Or just the sense that somewhere in this town someone would be waiting for her letters, would read her words, would write back. She pulled the mailbox door closed and walked back toward home, as the snow began to fall again, those same soft meandering flakes that had greeted her arrival. This time they felt like promise. Hawthorne House glowed warm in the darkness, windows golden and welcoming. Inside, her grandmother's recipe box sat on the kitchen counter, waiting. Tomorrow she would start testing recipes, calculating quantities, planning her menus. Tomorrow she would put up signs in Candlewick Commons, would tell people about the mistletoe mixer, would begin the work of pulling her town and herself back toward warmth. Tonight she sat at the scarred butcher block island and opened her grandmother's recipe box with reverent attention. She pulled out the gingerbread card and read the note again. This made Henry propose the first time I baked it. Make it whenever you need someone to stay. Pippa smiled into the kitchen. She wouldn't be making it hoping someone would propose. But maybe she'd make it as a way of saying, stay. Everyone stay. Let me feed you. Let me help you find each other. Let me believe for a little while that purpose and connection were still possible, even for someone who'd failed at everything else. She measured out flour and spice and began to bake in the darkness, filling it with cinnamon, ginger, and the smell of hope.
Chapter 2. The north-facing window showed nothing but white. Snow clung to the branches of the dense thicket beyond the glass, each twig outlined in frost. The Vance woodshop was cold this morning, not the wet cold of town streets but the dry sharp cold of an unheated space. It was the day after Pippa Hawthorne arrived in Oakhaven, though Soren Vance didn't know that yet. Soren preferred the cold. Discomfort kept him awake, kept him working. The workshop was a cathedral of sorts, if one's god was efficiency and solitude. High timber rafters crossed the vaulted ceiling. Windows were sparse, deliberate. The light that filtered through the north-facing pane was pale and consistent, ideal for spotting imperfections in grain and joinery. The air hung heavy with the sharp bite of cedar, underlaid with the medicinal sweetness of pine resin and the mineral iron smell of machine oil. These were the only incense Soren required. His fingers moved across the surface of the Arbortech workbench, a custom-built monstrosity fashioned from a single slab of reclaimed timber he'd spent 3 months salvaging and finishing 5 years ago. The wood was scarred, its surface a topography of gouges and marks earned through years of work. He ran his touch across one groove, remembering the job that had created it. Before Caspian. Before everything had turned to ash. The memory tasted bitter. Soren pulled his hand back and returned to his current project, a writing desk commissioned by someone 3 states away who would never know his name. They would know only the quality of the work. That was how he preferred it. Through the window, he could see the town proper in the distance, wrapped in its festive delusion. Garlands wound around lampposts. Lights strung between buildings in patterns that served no purpose except decoration. Someone had hung an oversized wreath on the town hall. The whole place had tilted towards celebration, with the predictability of a spinning top. Soren watched it the way one might watch a nature documentary, interesting, ultimately irrelevant to his own existence. He was marking measurements on the desk piece when he heard the truck. The sound of an engine on the country road was rare enough to register. The sound of an engine that slowed, that turned, that approached his workshop deliberately, that irritated him. Soren set down his pencil with deliberate care, moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to economy. The truck, a sensible sedan actually, more rust than paint, came to a stop in the gravel lot outside. Soren didn't turn from his work. Whoever it was would either state their business or move along. He had learned not to expend emotion on minor interruptions. He heard the car door. The crunch of footsteps on frozen gravel. The pause, while the visitor apparently took stock of the building. The barn doors were closed. He had locked them. The message was clear enough. He was not receiving visitors. The knock came anyway. Gentle. Persistent. The knock of someone accustomed to being eventually let in. Soren closed his eyes. Counted to 5. Then he set down his tools and moved toward the side entrance. Anya Solberg stood on the threshold, framed against the white morning like a watercolor in muted tones. She was diminutive. Everyone seemed tall next to her, though Soren was particularly so. Her white hair was pinned in its usual bun, and she wore a floral print dress beneath a hand-knitted cardigan the color of oatmeal. The locket she never removed sat at the hollow of her throat. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, her eyes held a cheerfulness that made Soren's teeth ache. "Good morning, Soren," she said. Her voice was gentle as snow settling on a still pond. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," he said. Not unkindly. He didn't bother to make unkindness a performance, but neither did he see the point in false warmth. "Yes, well, I won't stay long." She smiled at him, a real smile, not the polished social thing most people deployed. "May I come in? It's frightfully cold out here." He stepped back. There was no genuine way to refuse Anya Solberg. She had held the town together for 3 decades through sheer force of gentle will. Refusing her was like refusing snow in January, theoretically possible, futile in practice. The workshop's interior always surprised visitors. The ordered chaos of tools, the industrial geometry of machines, the total absence of comfort. Anya, however, simply looked around with the patience of someone who understood that spaces reflected the people who inhabited them. "Still the most beautiful place in Oakhaven," she said softly. Soren didn't respond. Compliments made him restless. He waited, jaw set, while she moved slowly through the space, her weathered fingers trailing along the Arbortech workbench's edge. The gesture was reverent. She had commissioned 2 pieces from him over the years. Both had cost her significant money. Both she had given as gifts to others. "I'm here about the winter wishes letter exchange," she said finally, turning to face him with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating objective fact rather than making a request. The irritation that had been merely present became acute. "No. I haven't even explained it yet." "Don't need explanation." Answer is still no. Anya clasped her fingers in front of her, intertwining them with the grace of age. "It's quite simple. Everyone who participates writes a letter, a genuine letter, not a card, telling about their hopes for the new year. The deepest hopes. The ones we don't typically share. Then the letters are paired, and each writer receives a response. A stranger's thoughts on their wishes. Encouragement from someone who doesn't know their history or their failures. Sounds like something designed by someone who enjoyed emotional suffering." "I designed it," Anya said gently. 20 years ago. After my Harold died. Soren opened his mouth. Closed it. This was the trap of kindness. You couldn't be cruel to someone who had genuinely suffered without becoming the villain in your own story. He said nothing instead. Loneliness is a heavy thing, Anya continued, moving to the high window. People carry it like shame. As though choosing solitude should be sufficient if one simply chooses it firmly enough. As though the hunger for connection is weakness masquerading as preference. His chest tightened. Soren turned back to his workbench, needing to move. I knew Harold for 47 years, she said, still looking out the window. The first year after he died, I thought solitude was what I needed. I was wrong. The solitude became a habit. Then it became a prison. This exchange, receiving the first letter from a stranger whose name I'll never know, reminded me that isolation is not the same as peace. Good for you. The words came out sharper than he'd intended. She turned to face him, and her expression wasn't offended. If anything, she looked sad for him in a way that made his entire body go rigid. You're not immune to loneliness, Soren. None of us are. Even the strongest, most capable people. Especially them. I'm not lonely. I'm occupied. Yes. I can see that. She glanced at the scrap pile, the orderly stack of discarded wood pieces he kept in the corner of the workshop, wood he couldn't quite bring himself to burn or dispose of. How much had she understood? Occupation and loneliness aren't mutually exclusive, though. One can be thoroughly occupied and still be alone. Soren's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. Participate in the exchange, Anya said. Not a question. Write your letter. Tell someone, a stranger, what you hope for when the world isn't listening. What you wish might change. What you're too tired to try for anymore, but wish someone believed was still possible. And in return, I receive a letter from some equally delusional individual who thinks words on paper constitute meaningful connection. Or perhaps you receive a letter from someone who understood your wish more clearly than you do. Someone who reflects back to you the validity of what you secretly hope for. Sometimes a stranger's faith in your wish is exactly what your own doubt cannot withstand. She smiled at him, genuinely kind, without pity. You don't have to share your name. You don't have to explain yourself. You simply write what your heart wants to say and someone responds. That's all. Soren moved to the workbench and picked up his pencil. It was a dismissal, polite only in the sense that he didn't throw her bodily from the workshop. I'll take your silence as a yes, Anya said. Your interpretation of my silence is your own problem. Indeed. She moved toward the door, her small frame silhouetted against the pale light. Bring your letter to the community center by the 15th. We're gathering them beforehand for the pairing. She paused at the threshold and turned back. And Soren. Thank you. For trying. Even if you're not certain you are. After she left, he stood motionless in the center of his workshop, listening to the sound of her car starting, the slow crunch of tires on frozen gravel, the gradual diminishment of the engine sound as she turned back toward town. He looked at the north-facing window. At the thicket beyond. At the pure, uncomplicated whiteness of snow. Then he looked at his workbench. At the half-finished desk for a stranger. At the tool marks across the wood, evidence of care and failure. Soren returned to his work, but the measurements blurred. He blinked hard. Dust from the workshop. Nothing more. He didn't get emotional about visits from elderly women and their gentle manipulations. But later, when the light had shifted and afternoon came, he found a fresh sheet of paper. Ordinary stock from a pad he kept for sketching designs. He set it on the corner of the workbench and stared at it for a long time. He didn't write anything. He also didn't throw it away. The workshop settled back into quiet, the dry cold, the smell of cedar and resin and machine oil, the pale north light. In the distance, barely audible, the town continued its festive preparations. Someone had started playing music somewhere. The sound was muted by distance and walls, almost a memory of music rather than the thing itself. Soren picked up his pencil and returned to the measurements on the desk. The work was good. The work was honest. It required no apologies and no explanations. His eyes kept drifting to that blank sheet of paper in the corner of his workbench. The sheet that Anya Solberg had somehow convinced him, without ever issuing a direct command, that he would eventually fill. He was still staring at it when the winter afternoon began to darken and the world beyond the thicket grew indistinguishable from the sky.
Chapter 3. The shop had transformed overnight, or at least that's how it felt to Pippa as she arranged the last plate of gingerbread on the cookie counter, her fingers trembling with nervous energy that felt like joy. It was December 5th, the opening day of the mistletoe mixer, and the formerly vacant storefront on Candlewick Commons was no longer vacant, no longer a dark and dusty invitation to her imagination, but alive and fragrant. She stepped back and surveyed the space, and her eyes prickled with happy tears. Ridiculous, but she couldn't help it. The front windows fogged from the heat of the ovens. Inside, the air was thick and golden, ginger and cinnamon and cardamom from the spiced cakes she'd baked since 4 a.m, undercut with the deep chocolate richness of the hot chocolate she'd prepared in enormous batches. The overhead lights cast everything in warm amber, making the shop look less like a real place and more like a Christmas memory, the kind you could taste. The matchmaking board dominated the far wall, and Pippa glanced at it with pride. She'd found the chalkboard at a vintage market in the next town over, all ornate wooden frame and beveled edges, and spent 3 hours painting it cream-colored and laying out the design. In her looping cursive, the same handwriting that filled her journals and grocery lists with underlined enthusiasm, she'd written "The Mistletoe Mixer S Matchmaking Board" in letters an inch tall with little sprigs of holly sketched in the corners. Below that, hearts waiting to find their match. Below that, open spaces waiting to be filled with the names of Oakhaven's lonely people. The kindness jar sat on a shelf beside the register, empty and gleaming. She imagined it filling with notes, anonymous encouragements, confessions, hopes written in careful ballpoint and uncertain cursive. She imagined people tucking notes inside and leaving lighter for it. The bell above the door chimed, and Pippa's chest jumped. The first customer of the Mistletoe Mixer's grand opening was Mrs. Eleanor Voss, whom Pippa had met during her initial wanderings around town, and she came through the door stamping snow from her boots with reverence. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening in awe. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Voss breathed. "It smells like Christmas morning." Pippa's face split into a grin that probably made her look slightly unhinged. "Welcome to the Mistletoe Mixer. Can I get you something? I have spiced cakes, gingerbread, hot chocolate. I made 3 kinds actually, dark chocolate and milk chocolate and white chocolate with peppermint and—" "One of each," Mrs. Voss interrupted, smiling, and that smile felt like a validation of every sleepless hour Pippa had spent preparing. "And I'm going to sit and enjoy every minute of it. This is wonderful, dear." By mid-morning, the shop was full. Not quite overflowing, but full in a way that suggested word had spread, or perhaps people simply sensed that something warm and good had opened on their commons. There were a young couple Pippa hadn't met, sharing a gingerbread cake and intertwined fingers. There was Mr. Peterson, who ran the bookshop 2 doors down, nursing a hot chocolate and reading the newspaper in the corner. There were 3 teenagers from the high school, their laughter high and bright as they decorated cookies from her display. There were the browsers, people who came in ostensibly for the baked goods but whose eyes kept drifting to the matchmaking board, who asked careful questions while pretending not to be interested. "This is just for fun, is it?" one woman had asked, a widow named Clara, eyeing the board with the expression of someone considering something dangerous. Pippa had squeezed her hand and assured her that magic, real honest magic, always started with hope. By the time the afternoon light slanted through the fogged windows, casting everything in blue-gray that preceded snow, Pippa was running low on cookies and high on purpose. Her feet ached, and there was a streak of cinnamon across her apron that made her look like a baker in a storybook illustration. She was tired in a way that felt like happiness. She had locked up at 5 o'clock, earlier than she'd planned, but the cookie counter had been thoroughly depleted, and made her way across town to the old Dispatch. The stone building looked handsome in the early winter twilight, its tall arched windows glowing with warm light from inside. Anya's corner was visible from the entrance, and Pippa could see Anya herself at her desk, writing something with meticulous care in the logbook. The letter exchange cubby box sat near the entrance like a wooden post office, its cubbies numbered and waiting. Pippa's breath caught as she approached. Her own number, she'd registered just over a week ago, was 47. Her fingers traced the polished wood and found the slot marked with her number, pulled open the small door. There was a single envelope inside. Her letter. Her first letter from her assigned pen pal. The envelope was small and square, and the paper visible through the slot looked unusual, thicker than normal letter writing paper, with a faint grid pattern printed on the back. Pippa withdrew it with care, almost reverent, and turned it over. A schematic. Not the finished printed kind she'd seen in architecture books, but a hand-drawn one, in precise mechanical pencil, showing what looked like the structural support for some kind of wooden frame. The handwriting, the actual letter written in blue ink across the back of the schematic, was sharp and economical, every letter formed with exact minimal strokes. Dear Winter Wishes Correspondent. I received your letter. I understand that you are newly arrived in Oakhaven, and have grand plans to fix what is broken, and right what is wrong in the community through baking and matchmaking. Manage expectations. You do not know these people. You do not know what you do not know about them. Kindness is not a strategy, and optimism is not a plan. Broken things often break again in the same places. I will write back. I do not promise that what I write will be encouraging. Your Winter Wishes Correspondent. Pippa read it 3 times, her initial surge of joy curdling into something more complicated, a mix of indignation and intrigue. She turned the schematic over in her palms, studying the pencil lines, the careful notation in the margins. Whoever had sent this had steady hands and a methodical mind. Whoever had sent this was, she suspected, quite unhappy. She traced one of the words with her fingertip, manage expectations, and curiosity struck her unexpectedly. What did these hands look like holding a pen? Was the precision born of practice, or temperament? The questions came unbidden. She tucked the letter away, before examining them too closely. It was just the mystery of it, she told herself. Nothing more than being intrigued by a puzzle. Which meant they needed the Winter Wishes letter exchange more than anyone. She tucked the letter back into her pocket and decided, with characteristic optimism, not to be discouraged by being told to manage expectations. Managing expectations was precisely the opposite of what the world needed. The world needed wild, unreasonable hope. The world needed people brave enough to bake cookies and set up matchmaking boards and believe in connection. Besides, there was something endearing about the bluntness of the letter. Whoever had written it had bothered to write back, had bothered to send a schematic, which suggested they made things, built things, put care into their work even if they didn't believe care mattered. It was a start. Pippa was turning to leave, already mentally composing her response, when she heard a commotion outside. She stepped back out onto the commons. There, Eleonora Finch and Gideon Croft, standing perhaps 10 feet apart on the sidewalk in front of their respective shops. Eleonora stood with arms crossed, boots planted, her gaze cutting. Gideon pocketed his hands, shoulders loose, but his eyes stayed frozen at 0. Neither of them was speaking. The quiet between them held weight and texture, pressing down on the town square like snow gathering before a storm. Lovely evening, Gideon said finally, his voice mild as cream. Eleonora replied, which wasn't really a word, just a sound of dismissal. The quiet resumed. Pippa's mind worked quickly, leaping forward in the way it did when she saw patterns, when she sensed the invisible architecture of loneliness. Eleonora, fierce and independent, resentful of change. Gideon, smooth and ambitious, representing exactly the kind of new thing that threatened what Eleonora had inherited. There was a story here, one written in the tension of their silence, in the way neither of them looked at each other but somehow looked at nothing else. By the time Gideon turned and walked back into the modern hearth with his measured tread, and Eleonora stalked back into Finch's fine fittings with her boots ringing sharply on the pavement, Pippa had already decided. She walked back into the old dispatch on legs that felt purposeful and sure, approached the matchmaking board with a piece of chalk held like a pen, and wrote 2 names in the empty spaces. Eleonora Finch and Gideon Croft, connected by a careful, hopeful chalk heart with a question mark floating above it like a star. She stood back and examined her work, her hazel eyes bright with the confidence of someone who has no real reason to be confident but is anyway. The board was filling up. The board was working. The world was full of people standing apart, and all they needed was someone foolish or brave or both to draw a heart between them and call it possibility. Pippa had flour on her apron, exhaustion in her bones, and a brutally honest letter in her pocket, telling her to manage expectations. She had never felt more undeterred. She left the old dispatch as the streetlights flickered on across Candlewick Commons, casting their warm glow on the shop windows, on the commons, on the chalk heart she'd drawn connecting 2 people who almost certainly would rather be struck by lightning than acknowledge what Pippa could so clearly see. They were waiting. They were all waiting. And Pippa, with her oversized sweater and her flour-dusted apron, and her absolute refusal to let the world stay broken, was going to introduce them to the possibility that they didn't have to wait alone.
Chapter 4. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between the barn door and the frame where Soren fetched his mail. Cream-colored. Expensive stock. Embossed snowflakes catching the winter light. He knew what it was before opening it. The letter exchange had begun its rotation. He'd agreed to this fool's errand 2 weeks ago under Anya's relentless pressure, and here was the proof of his weakness, waiting on the workbench beside a half-finished cabinet door. Soren made coffee first. Strong black, no ceremony. He settled into the high window seat, where weak December sunlight streamed across his shoulders, and opened the envelope with the same deliberation he'd use for a faulty joint. The paper inside was thick, soft. Her handwriting sprawled across the page in loops and flourishes, the script of someone who'd practiced cursive and still believed in its importance. Every inch was filled. Margins. She'd crossed them out and written along the edges. Dear Correspondent, 42. What an absolute joy to receive your letter. And what a mysterious first impression you make, a schematic. I'm trying to imagine what you might be drawing. Architecture. Machinery. A contraption for brewing the perfect cup of tea. I must confess my excitement about this whole endeavor, even though your note suggested I ought to manage expectations. I think that's rather practical advice, so I shall take it to heart, though I'm afraid my nature rebels against caution. I simply cannot help myself, the world seems so full of possibility. Allow me to introduce myself properly, or at least as properly as pen pals can. I've recently arrived in Oakhaven and opened a small bakery called the Mistletoe Mixer. It's been the most marvelous adventure. The community has been so wonderfully warm, and I find myself thinking about all the people in this town, the quiet ones, the lonely ones, the ones who haven't quite found their place. And I've had the most delightful idea. What if we could help people find each other? Not in a meddlesome way, you understand, but in the way a good recipe brings ingredients together in just the right proportion to create something beautiful. I do hope you don't think me foolish. I know your letter suggested that expectations lead to disappointment, but I believe that kind hearts and honest effort can accomplish remarkable things. The town is already proving it. Just this week, I noticed 2 people who seem destined for each other, and I've had an idea to introduce them. I've even started a little board in the bakery, where townspeople can leave their thoughts about potential matches. The letter continued for several more pages. Paragraphs about the joy of baking, the charm of Oakhaven's cobblestone streets, the satisfaction of a perfectly risen croissant, observations about the town's elderly couples, the isolated craftspeople, the people who needed encouragement to find community. Underneath it all, woven through every sentence, optimism. Naive, unearned, almost aggressive in its cheerfulness. Soren set the letter down on his thigh. His coffee had gone lukewarm. She wanted to play matchmaker. She believed in possibility. She'd opened a bakery and already convinced herself that grand plans would accomplish remarkable things. 6 months. She'd give herself 6 months before reality corrected her. He picked the letter up again, irritated that he was reading it a second time. The handwriting was honest, no studied perfection, just genuine enthusiasm bleeding through the pen strokes. She'd written in margins and between lines, unable to contain herself. The snowflake stationery was ridiculous, but there was something earnest about it. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was just this way. Enthusiastic. Convinced of goodness. A matchmaking board in a bakery, Soren thought, nearly laughing. Not cruelly. Just with the weight of someone who'd learned that grand plans were mostly scaffolding for disappointment. He turned the letter over. The second page had started with excited observations, then deteriorated into a hastily scrawled postscript, P.S. I do apologize for filling up so much paper. My friends always say I could have gotten my point across in a paragraph, but I've never learned the virtue of brevity. I hope you don't mind a verbose correspondent. At least she knew it. Soren set the pages aside and stood. His knees protested. He'd been sitting motionless for longer than he realized. He walked the length of the workshop, past the Arbortech bench with its perfect geometry of tools, past the scrap pile where he kept wood too beautiful to discard. His eye caught on the high shelf above the south wall. The flawed dovetail box sat where it always sat, exactly where he'd placed it 5 years ago. Unfinished. Unremarkable, except for its failure. The wood was walnut, rich and dark, and the craftsmanship was sound, except for the corner where the dovetail joint had splintered. One tail was cracked, the wood grain following the weakness he'd created. The joint refused to fit flush. The box would never close properly. The box had been a prototype for the joinery intended for their masterpiece, the signature Oakhaven trestle table. It was a design Soren had labored over for a year, featuring a unique, floating tenon that allowed the heavy oak to seem as though it were hovering over the base. Caspian had called it the future of the brand, but when Soren made that one minor error on the dovetail box, Caspian used it to suggest Soren was losing his touch, a calculated move to distance him from the intellectual property they were building. It was their last collaboration. His and Caspian's. Before the betrayal. Before the theft, the ruined accounts, and the nearly destroyed business. Before Soren had learned the specific flavor of having your trust treated like a commodity. The splintered joint had been Soren's mistake. A moment of carelessness. He'd brought it to Caspian expecting pragmatic solutions, and instead had been met with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Can't have mistakes in our work, Caspian had said. We need everything to be perfect. Then he'd left the box on the bench as a monument to Soren's imperfection. 3 months later, Caspian was gone. Along with the designs. Along with money. Soren turned away from the shelf. He still remembered the hollow ring in his chest when he walked into a high-end showroom in the city, 6 months after Caspian vanished with the accounts. He had expected to find Caspian hiding. Instead, he found his own soul on display. There, in the center of the floor, sat the Oakhaven trestle table, but the placard beside it read, "The Caspian Collection." Seeing his unique, hand-carved joinery, the specific geometry he had sweated over at his Arbortech bench, mimicked by a mass-production machine, was a violation worse than the stolen money. It wasn't just a theft of funds, it was the theft of his name. If the world only wanted the perfection Caspian had promised by erasing the man who actually built it, Soren decided the world didn't need to see him at all. He found a scrap of paper, the reverse of an old printed schematic still readable in faint gray ink. He found a pencil, sharpened it with a utility knife until the point was needle-fine. His handwriting came out small and efficient, every word precise. Dear Correspondent 1. Thank you for your letter. Your enthusiasm is noted. A word of caution. Town projects have a way of exceeding their original scope. Start modest. Vet your matches carefully before introducing them. People are not recipes. They don't always combine as intended. The cost of a failed union is higher than you might anticipate. That said, you seem genuine. That's rare. Hold on to it. The schematic you asked about was a corner cabinet. No contraption. Just wood and geometry. Best regards, Correspondent 42. He read it over twice. The pragmatism was there. The warning. But underneath was something he didn't want to examine. Soren folded the response into a clean envelope. He'd mail it tomorrow. For now, he set it on the corner of the workbench, weighted down with a chisel so it wouldn't blow away. Back at the high window, he gathered Pippa's letter. 5 pages of exuberance. 5 pages of a woman who believed in the goodness of connection. Who'd built a bakery and a matchmaking board and convinced herself that careful effort could repair the solitary places in people's lives. It was impossible, naive. He folded the letter carefully, instead of discarding it. He set it in the small drawer beneath the window seat, beneath old catalogs and sketches. By the time dusk fell, he'd convinced himself it was purely practical. The flawed dovetail box remained on its shelf, gathering dust beneath the winter light. It held nothing. It served no purpose. Yet Soren found himself thinking about it as he swept the workshop floor, as he locked the barn door against the cold, as he walked back to his house through snow that had begun to fall again, quiet and persistent. Some things, once broken, taught you more than any intact thing ever could. Some things, once betrayed, made you careful about hope. He'd written her letter, though. He'd answered her enthusiasm with warnings and practical advice. He'd taken the time to sharpen a pencil and choose his words. Soren climbed the steps to his porch, shaking snow from his shoulders. He was annoyed with himself for caring, annoyed that her earnestness had been enough to stop him from throwing her letter away, annoyed that he'd felt compelled to respond with anything other than silence. Tomorrow he would mail the letter and get back to his work. To his solitude. To the specific geometry of wood and joint, where failure was visible and could be learned from, where nothing required the kind of faith that had almost destroyed him. Tonight, stepping into his warm kitchen, he thought about a woman he'd never met. Someone who filled pages with hope, opened bakeries on impulse, believed a matchmaking board could heal loneliness. The faith would fail. It always did. But he'd wanted for one moment, before he caught himself, for it not to.
Chapter 5. Pippa held the letter at arm's length, as though distance might change its meaning. It wouldn't. She'd already read it 3 times in the past 10 minutes, each pass cementing the same uncomfortable feeling in her chest, a sensation she determinedly classified as not doubt. The handwriting was neat and precise as ever, each letter formed with the kind of care that suggested a man who took his words seriously. Unfortunately for Soren, he'd taken them seriously in precisely the wrong direction. Some problems aren't meant to be fixed by outsiders, he'd written. People have their reasons for keeping distance. You can't force understanding through optimism. It doesn't work that way. Pippa set the letter down on the kitchen counter of the mistletoe mixer, right beside her open recipe notebook. The paper fell softly against the marble, and she picked up a wooden spoon instead, turning it over in her palms as if it might offer counsel. It didn't, but the familiar weight was grounding. It was the second week of December, which meant they'd been exchanging letters for just over a month, long enough for Pippa to recognize the stubborn nobility in Soren's warnings. He didn't understand. That was the thing about Soren, brilliant as he clearly was, with his neat letters and his devastating observations about human nature, he'd missed the most important part. He thought optimism was naive. He thought fixing things was impossible. But he'd never stood in a room and watched 2 people's faces light up when they recognized they'd been wrong about each other. She found herself wondering, unbidden, whether his spoken words carried the same careful weight as his written ones, whether his voice would be as spare and precise as his sentences. She pushed the thought away and picked up her wooden spoon again. Pippa had. Once when she was 22, she'd introduced her friend Marcus to her cousin Lily at a Christmas party. Marcus had been convinced he was unlovable, Lily had thought all men were selfish. They'd married 3 years later. That was the proof. That was the evidence that would stand up in any court, even the court of Soren's pragmatic mind. She picked up the letter again and read the closing. I'm not saying don't try. I'm saying don't be blindsided when it fails. Blindsided. As if she hadn't already considered the possibility. As if she were walking through this with her eyes closed, which was frankly insulting. Pippa folded the letter and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Then she pulled out her recipe notebook with determination. The Better Together gingerbread loaf had come to her at 3 a.m, a vision that felt less like an idea and more like a calling. It was the perfect vehicle for her plan, substantial enough to be a gesture, delicious enough to be undeniable, and visually compelling enough that Eleonora and Gideon would have to stop and look at it. Really look. Not the way they looked at each other across the town square, with their narrow eyes and pressed mouths. But the way people looked at something beautiful and carefully made. She began with the quiet work of it, measuring, mixing, the familiar rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Flour and spices combined into the bowl, cloves, nutmeg, allspice, ginger, each one a voice in the chorus that would warm through the loaf. But she added something unexpected, half a teaspoon of cardamom, that ambitious, hopeful spice that nobody ever seemed to use in American baking. It would surprise them. It would make them taste something they didn't know they were tasting, and maybe that small surprise would open something in them. The molasses came next, dark as the night sky, poured thick and slow into its bowl. She creamed the butter and sugar, beat in the egg, added the molasses, and watched the separate ingredients surrender to each other, flour disappearing into the wet mixture. Her fingers moved with the muscle memory of thousands of baked goods, needing no recipe, no thought. The dough came together glossy and dark and alive, and she chilled it while her mind worked ahead to the rest. The presentation was everything. It wasn't enough to simply hand them each a slice. No, that was the kind of thinking that Soren would use, efficient, practical, completely missing the point. Instead, she would invite them both to the bakery at the same time, in carefully calculated succession. A special treat for Eleonora, who'd been so supportive. A special treat for Gideon, who'd sent customers her way. They would arrive within minutes of each other, and there, on the counter in the mistletoe mixer, would be the loaf. Magnificent. Undeniable. By the time the dough had chilled to perfect consistency, Pippa pressed it into the larger loaf pan, the one that would yield something big enough for 2 people to share, maybe even a third portion for customers to admire. She pressed it down gently but firmly. No air pockets. No hesitation. The dough accepted her attention. 20 minutes at 375 degrees while the kitchen filled with the smell of ginger and clove, and that deep, almost chocolate-like richness of molasses. It was the smell of Christmas and comfort, and the magic that only happened in kitchens, where separate ingredients became something better together. While it baked, she prepared the royal icing, egg whites and powdered sugar whisked to stiff peaks, clouds of edible potential. A tiny pinch of blue food coloring, just enough to tint it a pale, frosty blue that evoked winter without being heavy-handed about it. The piping was where magic lived. Her fingers moved without thought, creating a woman in a sharp laser, Eleonora in miniature, all angles and strength, and a man looking suspiciously like Gideon in outline. And then, the part that made her heart flutter with creative confidence, she piped them holding hands. The hands connected, fingers intertwined, the icing flowing from one figure to the other in a gesture so simple and so loaded with meaning that she had to stop and look at it. It was perfect. Once the loaf had cooled completely, Pippa turned it out onto her favorite serving platter, white ceramic with a gold rim, and the blue icing looked even better against the deep brown of the baked good, ethereal and hopeful. She added small dots of green icing for holly leaves around the figures, and a tiny red icing berry. When she stepped back to admire her work, Pippa felt the flutter of excitement mixed with something else. Nervousness, perhaps. The sense that she was about to set something in motion that couldn't be unmade. But also defiance. Soren could write his cautious letters and shake his head all he wanted. She understood something he didn't. Some people needed permission to change their minds. Some people needed a reason to look at each other differently. And sometimes, just sometimes, a beautifully made gingerbread loaf was exactly that reason. She covered the platter loosely with plastic wrap and placed it on the counter in the most prominent position, where anyone entering the bakery would see it immediately. Then she pulled out her calendar and began planning when to invite Eleonora and when to invite Gideon, calculating the precise minutes between their arrivals with military precision. Tomorrow afternoon. 3 o'clock for Eleonora. 3:15 for Gideon. Perfect. Pippa's heart was racing, that nervous excitement that came from being on the edge of something. The edge of a plan. The edge of potential. The edge of possible failure, yes, but also the edge of something working out as she'd envisioned it. She pulled out a piece of paper and began drafting the invitations in her best handwriting. Each word was careful, each phrase calculated to sound spontaneous and genuine. Because it was genuine, her desire for them to see each other, to see themselves, was real. It was the orchestration that was slightly questionable, but Pippa had decided long ago that the moral complexities of matchmaking were worth the reward of being right. And she was going to be right about this. She had to be. The gingerbread loaf sat on its white platter, its icing figures holding hands in permanent perfect harmony. It was a promise, Pippa thought. It was a promise that some things could be fixed if you tried hard enough, believed strongly enough, and baked well enough. Tomorrow would prove that Soren was wrong. Tomorrow would prove that optimism wasn't naive. Tomorrow would prove that sometimes love, or in this case at least friendship, just needed the right push. And the right push, Pippa had discovered, tasted like spiced cake and hope. Chapter 6. The mistletoe mixer was in full Saturday afternoon swing when Pippa decided to detonate her future. She could feel it in her bones as she stood behind the counter, the gingerbread loaf on the marble surface, wrapped in tissue paper the color of fresh cream. The Better Together masterpiece. 48 hours of planning, 3 failed batches, and 1 encouraging text from her pen pal that she had ignored. "You don't understand," she'd written back. "Sometimes people need a little help seeing what's right in front of them." Pippa checked her watch. 3:15. Gideon had confirmed he'd stop by for supplies for his morning displays. Eleonora came in Saturday afternoons. She'd mentioned it twice, once in passing about needing cinnamon, and once while loudly informing everyone that she never changed her schedule for anyone. Perfect conditions for a disaster. The bakery hummed with winter afternoon contentment. Customers browsed the cookie counter, where Pippa's latest creations, snowflake shortbread, cranberry pistachio biscotti, had drawn the usual crowd. Mrs. Reed studied the matchmaking board with the intensity of someone reading ancient prophecy. The kindness jar near the register jingled as someone dropped in a note. Everything was bright and full of possibility. Pippa smoothed the tissue paper around the gingerbread loaf one more time. The icing work had come out perfectly. A tiny figure in a tool belt stood beside a figure in a tailored blazer, their fingers nearly touching. The message on the base, piped in her most careful script, read, "Better Together." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "Sometimes the best innovations honor what came before." She'd agonized over that message. Was it presumptuous? Preachy? No, it was hopeful. It belonged on the matchmaking board. The bell above the door chimed. Gideon stepped in first, brushing snowflakes from his charcoal overcoat. He looked exactly as he always did, polished, composed, expensive. He nodded at customers as he made his way toward the counter, his eyes landing on Pippa with pleasant recognition. "Pippa. Just the person I needed. I'm developing a new tiramisu with white chocolate," he began. The bell chimed again. Eleonora arrived like a northeast wind. She wore her work apron, faded denim, the Finch's Fine Fittings logo barely visible after 20 years of washing. Gray streaks in her hair pulled tight in a no-nonsense bun. Her eyes cut like glass. When Gideon appeared at the counter, her entire body compressed inward, a spring loading. "Oh," she said flatly. "You." Gideon's pleasant expression didn't flicker, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Eleonora. I didn't know you'd be." "Saturday afternoons," she interrupted. "As I've come to understand, some of us keep to our routines." This was it. This was the moment. Pippa's pulse quickened as she picked up the gingerbread loaf. The tissue paper crinkled. Around them, the bakery had gone quiet in that peculiar way crowds do when they sense drama. Mrs. Reed's eye was very sharp indeed now. A teenager behind the gingerbread display pretended to study cookies, while absolutely listening. "Actually," Pippa said, her voice climbing to that strained, cheerful pitch that meant she was ignoring every warning her instincts sent. "I'm so glad you're both here." Gideon's attention sharpened. Eleonora's eyes narrowed. "I've been thinking," Pippa continued, unwrapping the tissue paper with ceremony, "about how we're all part of this community and how conflict is really just different approaches to the same goal." The gingerbread loaf revealed itself in the bakery's golden light, the icing work catching their eyes. She'd meant it to be charming. She'd meant it to be a bridge. Eleonora stepped forward and looked at it. Her jaw tightened. "Is that supposed to be me?" "It's representing the hardware legacy and," Pippa started. "With a tool belt." Eleonora's voice cut sharp and low. "You've put my entire family's lifetime of work in a tool belt, next to this," she gestured at Gideon without looking at him, "corporate plant in a designer suit. As if we're a matching set. As if centuries of craft should just vanish beside his profit margins." "Eleonora," Gideon said, and there was real frustration in his voice now, the polish cracking slightly, "I'm not the villain in whatever narrative you've constructed. I built a store that serves this community." "You built a chain store," she fired back, finally turning to face him directly. "You came into our town, a place that was struggling, and you built something shiny and new and deliberately designed to make places like mine obsolete. And the worst part? The absolute worst part? You do it with this calm, rational voice about progress and innovation, while you're systematically destroying a business that's been here for 3 generations. My father built that store. My grandfather built it before him. And you're going to destroy it, with better lighting and a coffee bar." "I didn't close the mill," Gideon said, and now his composure was genuinely strained. "I wasn't here 15 years ago when that happened. I came here as a solution, and you've decided I'm the problem. You've decided that progress and tradition are incompatible, and honestly, that's on you, not on me." "A solution?" Eleonora's laugh was bitter. "That's what you tell yourself at night, is it? You're not a predator, you're a solution? You're not calculating the exact profitable moment to move into a vulnerable market and drain it dry?" "That's not fair," Gideon said. The frustration overtook his smoothness entirely. "You don't know me. You don't know why I came here or what I've tried to do. You've decided I'm the embodiment of everything that's wrong with modern business, and I can't defend myself against that, because it has nothing to do with reality, and everything to do with fear." "I'm not afraid of you," Eleonora snapped. "You're terrified," Gideon said. His voice went quiet, worse than shouting. "You're terrified because the world is changing and you can't control it, and it's easier to make me a villain than to figure out how to actually compete." The silence that followed was absolute. Customers stopped all pretense of other activities. Mrs. Reed froze mid-cookie. Even the bakery's warmth had curdled into something cold and observational. Pippa stood between them, still holding the gingerbread loaf. "That's not," Eleonora began, her voice tight. "You know what?" Gideon cut her off. Weariness overtook his composure. "I don't have time for this. I came here for supplies, and ended up in a counseling session I didn't ask for." He looked at Pippa directly. Pity marked his expression. "I'm sorry about whatever this was supposed to be. I appreciate the effort." He turned and walked toward the door, each footstep loud as a gavel. Eleonora didn't move, just stood there with her jaw clenched, staring at the gingerbread loaf as if it had personally betrayed her. Which Pippa realized it had. "Elle," she started, desperately trying to salvage something, anything. "I just thought." "You thought wrong," Eleonora said flatly. She didn't raise her voice, which was somehow worse than if she had. "You thought wrong, and you made your thinking into a pastry, and you served it to both of us without bothering to ask if we wanted to be fixed." The door chimed as Gideon left, taking all the oxygen with it. Eleonora picked up the gingerbread loaf with 2 fingers, as if it smelled bad. The tissue paper tore slightly. "This is lovely work," she said, her tone contradicting the words. "But it reminds me of thinking that assumes making people feel nice erases their actual problems. That wrapping it pretty and saying the right words makes fundamentally opposed positions suddenly compatible." She set it down on the counter. The impact dislodged some of the delicate icing work on the blazer figure. "Some things can't be fixed by a baker with a matchmaking board," Eleonora said, and then she turned and left too, the door closing behind her with a much quieter chime than it deserved. The silence that followed was extraordinary. Pippa stood there, staring at the gingerbread loaf. The tool belt figure was fine. The blazer figure had a crack down the front, icing crumbling. The nearly touching fingers now looked obscene, not romantic, just presumptuous. Like she'd forced people together. Mrs. Reed set down her cookie selection and left. Other customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The bakery slowly returned to its normal hum, as if a bomb hadn't just detonated in its middle. Pippa picked up the loaf, her fingers trembling. The tissue paper was torn. A piece of icing fell onto the marble counter. She pressed her eyes shut, but that made it worse. She could see Eleonora's expression, could hear the disappointment in her voice, could feel every customer's judgment like a weight. She turned and walked toward the back room, still holding the ruined gingerbread loaf. The matchmaking board hung on the wall in her office, a cheerful cork board with its colorful notes and pins. The entry she'd made for Eleonora and Gideon was still there, her handwriting optimistic and careful. 2 hearts. 1 town. A chance to see eye to eye. She stood there for a moment looking at it, and then she reached up and pulled the note down. The ink smudged under her thumb. Pippa set the gingerbread loaf down on her desk, on the scattered plans and sketches and notes that had promised so much this morning. The crack in the icing spread as the loaf settled. The figures that were supposed to be together were coming apart. She sat down on her stool and buried her face. Outside, the Saturday afternoon continued. The bakery carried on. Pippa Hawthorne, optimist and amateur matchmaker, learned the first hard lesson about meddling in other people's lives. Sometimes the only thing more painful than failure is watching it happen in front of everyone you're supposed to serve. The mistletoe mixer hummed on around her, and she stayed in the back room among her ruined notions and her broken loaf, wondering how something that had felt so right could have gone so wrong.
Chapter 7. The Commons were crowded for a Saturday, 10 days before Christmas, and the weight of the holiday was settling over Oakhaven with visible urgency. Soren crossed toward the supply house without particular interest, his list folded in his coat pocket. Wood stain, new chisels, the sandpaper that old Mikhail kept in stock. He made this trip once a month. 1 trip was enough. He noticed the commotion at the mistletoe mixer first as a gathering. 5 or 6 people clustered near the window, their postures tense. The quality of their stillness suggested this was not casual browsing. Soren did not intend to look. He was good at not looking at things that didn't concern him. Then someone in the cluster shifted, and he caught sight through the fogged glass. Pippa. Even distorted by the window, even at a distance, there was no mistaking her. She stood behind the counter, one hand gripping a loaf of gingerbread. Her face was flushed. Not the warm flush of pride. The raw red of embarrassment. Across from her stood an older woman and an older man, town folk Soren had seen enough times at a distance, facing each other, not Pippa, their voices rising in a heated way that meant years of disagreement had finally crested. The woman said something about tradition, the man about progress, and neither seemed aware that they were doing this in a small bakery on a Saturday afternoon with an audience gathering like vultures. Soren kept walking. It wasn't his affair. But his eyes tracked the scene anyway, the way a compass needle finds north without being asked. He saw Pippa set the gingerbread down on the counter. Saw her step back, away from it, as though the loaf itself had betrayed her. Saw her press her palms against her apron. The light from the window caught the warm tones in her hair as she moved, and for a moment he registered her not as a complication in his carefully neutral town, but as a person, the particular way her shoulders curved, how her hands trembled against the flour-dusted fabric. He looked away from that detail. It was irrelevant. Behind her, barely visible on the shelf near the register, the kindness jar sat glass bright, half full of folded notes, evidence that people had been writing down their encouragements, their kindnesses, their small offerings of grace. Vindication arrived first, quick and sharp and almost satisfying. "I told her so." He'd written it clearly enough. Don't meddle, don't think you can fix broken things by baking them different. There was a lesson in ignoring good advice. There was a lesson in naivete. Then someone laughed. Not kindly. A nervous sound from the gathered onlookers that broke the tension and made it worse. Pippa's shoulders stiffened. The vindication soured. The shift happened like a room turning sour. One moment he was satisfied in his knowing, and the next he was remembering what it felt like to have an entire room watch you fail. To have your intentions crumble in front of witnesses. To feel judgment settle like dust. He turned away and continued toward the supply house. He did not look back again. The image stayed with him, the tremor in her hand as she gripped the loaf. The color in her face. Defeat settled into her posture. The supply house was warm and familiar. Mikhail barely looked up from his ledger. Soren collected his items in methodical order, paid in cash, and left within 10 minutes. He took a route home that avoided the commons. But the thought itched through his mind, whether Pippa had closed the bakery early. Whether she was home. Whether she was sitting in the dark, the way he sometimes did after grinding days. He didn't like the thought. It was inconvenient. It made him feel obligated in a way he'd been avoiding for weeks. By evening, he'd pushed it aside with the efficiency of long practice. He worked until his back ached, planing a piece of cherry wood, letting the rhythm settle his mind. When his fingers finally refused to work anymore, he lit the stove and made tea. The letter came on Thursday. He knew the envelope on sight. The handwriting was the same, Pippa's careful slanted script. He set it on his workbench and stared at it while the coffee cooled. The brevity struck him first. Dear friend, I think you were right. Not in the way that gives me any comfort, but right nonetheless. I spent so long telling myself that returning here was different from being let go, that this was my choice, my dream, my second chance. But today, I watched something I made become a symbol of my meddling. Of my arrogance. There is no recovering from arrogance, is there? Only the slow humiliation of knowing you walked in where you weren't needed and made things worse. I don't know why I'm writing to you. Because you won't tell me it will be all right. Because you'll be honest. Because honesty feels like the only thing I deserve right now. Your friend P. Soren read it twice. The paper trembled in his hands on the second pass, though he couldn't say why. The words were sparse, almost skeletal. No buoyancy to them, none of the earnest energy that usually made her letters feel written at a run. The raw thing underneath struck him. Not the failure itself, but the way she was meeting it, not with Pippa's usual determination to fix and improve and try again, but with the flat recognition of someone who had looked inside herself and found something rotten there. He knew that feeling. He'd lived in that feeling for 3 years after Caspian. He sat on the edge of his workbench and set the letter down carefully. Outside, the December wind was picking up, rattling the eaves of his cottage. The light was failing. He should light the lamps. He should eat. Instead, he sat with a letter that demanded something from him he wasn't prepared to give. But he'd already been prepared for weeks, hadn't he? Already marked the moment when Pippa stopped being a nuisance and became someone earnest. Someone who'd had the courage to come back and take another chance, and now had to live with its cost. He pulled a sheet of his own paper toward him. His handwriting was all angles and severity, the writing of someone who carved things for a living. He started and stopped 3 times. Dear P. You asked me to be honest. Here is what I've learned about failure. It is not the opposite of building something worthwhile. It is the foundation of it. Every dovetail joint that splits teaches you something about the grain. Every carving that runs astray teaches you about the wood. The failures don't erase the work. They are the work. You walked into a situation you didn't understand fully and tried to solve it. That was not arrogance. Arrogance would have been certainty. You took a risk. The risk didn't pay. This does not diminish you. What you built before this, the bakery itself, the things you've learned, the way people come to you because they know you'll try, that still stands. One failed loaf doesn't unmake the careful work of the rest. Imperfect things can still have value. In fact, I would argue that imperfect things are the only things with real value, because they're the only things that are honest. You're not a failure for trying. You're a person who tried. There's an important difference. Don't let one day convince you otherwise. I'm not good at kindness. This is directness. This is what I wish someone had told me when I thought the same things you're thinking now. Don't mistake it for cruelty. Your friend S. He read through it once, his jaw tightening at the awkwardness of some phrasing. Vulnerability leaked through the careful sentences. He considered crossing out the part about the failed loaf. It felt too close to their actual situation, like admitting he'd been watching. But he left it as it was. Rewriting meant explaining to himself why he cared enough to get the words right. He wasn't prepared for that. And beneath even that admission was something he couldn't articulate, a wanting to reach her that went beyond good correspondence, beyond the simple courtesy of response. He folded the letter with care and found an envelope in the drawer where he kept them. He sealed it and set it on the corner of his workbench, addressed in sharp angles. The letter sat there while he ate flavorless soup, while he tended the fire and watched evening deepen to dark, while he lay in bed, listening to the wind promise snow. By morning, he'd walked it to the post. He didn't think about what Pippa would do when she opened it. Didn't wonder if she'd recognize herself in his words about splits and carvings gone wrong. Didn't allow himself to imagine that his response might actually help her. But when he returned to his workshop and picked up the cherry wood again, his hands felt different. More careful. The blade met the grain with attention. That meant he was protecting something. Shaping something that mattered. He recognized it. He'd felt this way only rarely, the impulse to build something not because it would pay or because it would prove anything, but because the work itself had become essential. Because there was someone on the other end of it who might understand what he was trying to say. The vindication from Saturday never returned. In its place was something heavier. A protective anger on Pippa's behalf. An unfamiliar investment in whether she would survive this. He didn't examine it too closely. His cynical armor had developed a gap in it, and through that gap, something that had no business being there had carefully made its way inside. He told himself this was temporary. Once Pippa moved through this and recovered her buoyancy, once she returned to being the relentless optimist he'd been corresponding with all along, he could restore the old boundaries. Could return to being the distant voice of reason on the page. He didn't quite believe it. He wasn't ready to examine the alternatives. So he worked. He wrote no other letters. A week later, he made his supply run and saw, through the bakery window, Pippa behind the counter. She looked tired, but she was there. Still baking. That was enough. He almost believed it.
Chapter 8. Pippa hadn't left the house for 3 days since the Eleonora and Gideon disaster. She'd spent the first evening staring at her reflection, cataloging all the ways she'd miscalculated, misunderstood, misjudged. Her grandmother would have known better. The letter from Soren sat on the sunroom table, weighted down by a smooth stone from the garden. She'd read it a dozen times. Each reading revealed new layers, the careful choice of words, the way he'd written something worthwhile instead of something worth your time, as though the distinction mattered. Everything mattered when someone chose their words with such precision. She pulled out her favorite cream stationery, the one with embossed snowflakes that had cost a small fortune from the catalog. Her handwriting sprawled across the page in her usual enthusiastic manner, but today the words came slower, more deliberate. Dear friend. Your letter found me when I needed it most. That failure builds something worthwhile. I'd forgotten I was supposed to be failing along the way. I've been failing at everything that matters. The matchmaking attempt was just the most public version of something I've been doing privately for months. I fix other people's problems so I don't have to look at my own. I arrange their lives so I don't have to admit mine is coming apart at the seams. My grandmother left me this house and her legacy: make people feel love through food and care. And I'm failing at that too. I've been so focused on finding everyone else their perfect match that I don't know who I'm supposed to be without a project to fix. Is that the kind of failure that builds something worthwhile? I hope so. I'm rather stuck with it. Yours in confusion and gratitude, your persistent correspondent. Pippa sealed the envelope with wax and pressed her thumb to it, a literal fingerprint in place of her name. She set the letter on the hall table to be collected, then moved to the sunroom, where her grandmother's orchids waited. She found the spray bottle and began to mist, feeling potting soil beneath her fingertips. Mist check, move to the next. The rhythm eased her shoulders from their knot. By the time she finished, the sunroom smelled green and alive again. She sat on the bench and waited for Soren's response.
Soren read the letter in his workshop, standing by the high window where snow collected in the corners. He'd begun saving her letters in a box beneath the workbench, a habit he didn't examine closely. The honesty of her confession struck him differently than before. She'd been performative, even in her vulnerability. Now she was laying herself bare, asking a question that required more than his usual terse response. He turned back to the wood he'd been working on, a rocking chair that had been giving him trouble for weeks. The grain ran opposite to what he'd calculated, fighting against his initial design. He could scrap it, or he could let the wood tell him what it wanted to become. His hands moved over the wood, feeling the grain's direction. The cherry wanted curves rather than angles. He worked for hours, letting instinct guide him. When he stepped back, the rocking chair had transformed into something with unexpected grace. The mistakes had become features. Only then did he reach for schematic paper, flipping it to the blank side. His handwriting came sharp and small. "You're asking the wrong question. The failure that builds something worthwhile isn't fixed. It's accepted. My father taught me that without meaning to. He left me a workshop full of half-finished projects and the certainty that I would do everything better, more systematically, more correctly. I spent years finishing those projects his way. Perfect execution. Wasted effort. The moment I stopped trying to perfect his vision and let my own mistakes teach me, my hands finally understood what they were doing. Legacy isn't about replicating what someone else built. It's about taking what they taught you, even the unintentional lessons, and using it as the foundation for something entirely your own. You're not failing at your grandmother's legacy. You're failing at being a copy of what she was. That's not a failure. That's the only path forward. As for the confusion, good. Confusion means you're finally asking real questions instead of just acting. Yours in direct assessment, your correspondent with opinions. He folded the letter and folded it again, feeling its weight. He wanted to sign his name, but didn't. He placed it in the box beneath the workbench, listening to it settle against the others. Her letters. This correspondence had become the most honest conversation he'd had in years.
Pippa's eyes blurred as she read. She sat in the sunroom, surrounded by plants now more vibrant. The late afternoon light turned everything golden, and permission flooded through her. Permission to stop performing, to stop fixing, to stop being the town's version of herself. She held the letter with both hands, reading slowly. Her fingertips traced the small, efficient script, economical, precise. Every word earned its place. Outside the sunroom glass, the garden lay frost-white and dormant. Her grandmother had worked in this space, moving through the long, patient middle ground where most of life actually happened. She wrote back immediately, her pen moving quickly across the cream stationery, her handwriting spiraling with contained energy. "You're right, and I hate that you're right. If I'm not supposed to fix everyone else, I have to look at what needs fixing in me. That's terrifying. But there's something else you said. About your father. I want to know more. These letters are the first time in months I've felt like I could think clearly. You seem to understand something I'm only beginning to grasp. I spent so long learning to be the person who knows what everyone else needs, that I never learned to admit what I need. What do you do when you're confused? When you're failing? How do you bear it? My grandmother had a quote on a painted tile: "Hands at work, heart at rest." She was always making, always creating. Now I wonder if her hands found the answers her mind was too afraid to ask. Do you think that's possible? Yours in genuine question, Pippa. I'm including my name. You don't have to reciprocate. She set the pen down and read the letter over twice, then sealed it with the same cream wax, pressing her thumb to it once more. This time, the fingerprint felt deliberate. An offering.
Soren stared at the signature for a long time. Pippa. Soft but determined, like snowfall that could bury you if you weren't paying attention. He held the letter and walked to the high window. Snow was falling again, covering the thicket beyond his property line. The woods were muffled under white. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he worked on the rocking chair, letting her questions simmer beneath his focus. The wood revealed what it wanted to be. When dusk came, he set down his tools and clarity opened. He washed his hands in cold pump water and sat to write. Pippa. Your grandmother understood what most people spend their lives missing. The hands know what the heart needs. Your mind can torture itself in circles, but your hands, they know the difference between busy and present. When I'm confused, I go to the workshop and make something wrong on purpose. Let it fail fast so fear doesn't calcify. Hiding from failure makes it bigger. You're asking me to be honest. That's rare enough to return the favor. My father was brilliant, but couldn't accept that mastery requires mistakes. He worked himself into an early grave trying to be perfect. I spent years determined to be different, to actually understand the world instead of demanding it conform to my expectations. I'm still working on that. Probably always will be. Purpose finds you when you're genuinely working at something that matters, especially if you're failing at it. Your obsession with bringing people together through food isn't a failure. It's the real thing. The method might evolve, but the core, that's not broken. That's just starting. You can use my name. It's Soren. Yours in shared imperfection, Soren. He signed the name deliberately, feeling the weight of commitment. Full honesty now. No more anonymity to hide behind. He folded the letter with care and set it aside to collect tomorrow.
The letter arrived the next morning, brought by young Thomas from the old dispatch. Pippa tipped him an extra $1 and sat at the kitchen table to read, her hands trembling. She read it 3 times, stopping at his name. Soren. Solid and grounded in that single word. Then she went to the market, her first venture into town since the disaster. The December morning was crisp. At the spice merchant's, she bought fresh cinnamon and asked about his daughter. She selected apples carefully, lingered over her choices. These weren't strategic purchases. They were genuine. That evening she made bread. Her hands needed to work while her mind processed Soren's words. She kneaded for an hour, her forearms growing warm, her breathing matching the rhythm. The dough was alive beneath her hands, elastic and responsive. This was what her grandmother had known. Hands at work meant the thinking mind could rest. When the bread was baked golden brown, the kitchen smelled of yeast and possibility. She broke off a piece while warm, tasting satisfaction. With the letter beside her and fresh bread scenting the air, she wrote on new snowflake stationery. Soren. I made bread today. Not to fix or prove anything, but because my hands needed to work while my mind processed your words. Is that what you meant? That moment when the thinking mind finally gets quiet and the rest of you can function? I kneaded the dough for an hour, and it was wonderful. Honest in a way, arranging flowers or writing matchmaking letters could never be. I gave the bread to Mrs. Reed. Not to earn her favor, but because her husband had taken ill and she'd been too worried to cook properly. And then I realized that was exactly what my grandmother was always doing. Not performing kindness. Living it. The distinction is everything. Thank you for trusting me with your name. For trusting me with your grief about your father. It mattered. You matter. I'm understanding now that the confusion isn't failure. It's the beginning of learning how to be yourself, instead of how to be useful. There's more to figure out. But for the first time, I'm not dreading it. Yours in quiet discovery, Pippa.
Soren read the letter twice, letting each word settle. He sat by his high window, the workshop quiet. The nearly finished rocking chair had turned unexpectedly beautiful, the grain flowing in a direction that made it perfect. These letters were changing something, teaching him that imperfection could be honesty. He sat in the chair, letting it rock him gently. Back and forth. A rhythm as old as comfort. Peace settled in his chest for the first time in months. When dark came, he rose and lit the stove, made tea, and sat again. Then he wrote, Pippa. You're understanding faster than most people ever do. That's not a compliment to make you feel better. It's an observation. You're building something real now, instead of running from something false. I've been thinking about what you wrote. About my father. I haven't talked about that with another person in a very long time. Maybe because you asked honestly. Maybe because you seemed to genuinely want to understand, instead of fix. The latter is rare. The rocking chair I've been working on is finished. It's not what I planned to make. The wood argued with my design, and instead of fighting it, I listened. The result is better than my original vision. Your grandmother tried to teach you that same lesson. I find comfort in working with my hands. You find it in making bread. Both matter. Both are expressions of something that can't be said in words. These letters have become something I wasn't expecting. A conversation without the usual social conventions. The freedom of anonymity before I told you my name. The safety of knowing you're trying to understand instead of judge. I'm not good at friendship. I'm better at solitude. But you're teaching me those things aren't mutually exclusive. Thank you. Yours in unexpected understanding, Soren. He folded the letter and placed it in the collection box beneath the workbench. Her letters surrounded it now, 6 of them accumulating as evidence of something real.
Pippa held this letter close to her chest before reading it. A door opening. She sat in the sunroom surrounded by plants showing new growth, tiny leaves unfurling, buds tightening. The space smelled green and alive. She read the letter 3 times, and by the third reading, tears were on her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the relief of being understood by someone who truly saw her. Outside the glass, the December afternoon was losing light. She thought about the rocking chair, wood arguing with design. She thought about her bread, the dough resisting her plans, then becoming something better. She didn't write back immediately. Instead, she sat with Soren's words. Tomorrow she would tell him about opening a tea room in her grandmother's house, a place where people could come not to find their match but to find themselves. But tonight, she held his letter and felt the weight of genuine friendship, built not on fixing or performing, but on being honestly human with another person who saw you clearly. She pressed the letter to her forehead, breathing in the faint scent of workshop dust and old paper, and peace settled inside her. Home. Not the house, but this correspondence, this honesty, this understanding.
In his workshop, Soren sat in the rocking chair and watched snow fall outside his high window. The silence was no longer empty. It held something he hadn't felt in years, the quiet contentment of being known. The chair moved beneath him, gentle, reliable, honest. He ran his fingers along the wood grain, tracing the mistakes that had become features, and felt its rightness. He pulled out one more sheet of blank schematic paper and began to write, not because he had answers, but because Pippa had taught him that questions asked honestly and answered truthfully were the most valuable currency 2 people could trade.
Chapter 9. 1 week before Christmas, Pippa stood before the matchmaking board in the pre-dawn quiet of the bakery, studying the constellation of names and hearts she'd drawn over the previous weeks. The shop was hushed, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the ovens and the distant comforting thud of dough being prepped in the kitchen. The board dominated the far wall, its ornate cream-colored frame catching the first weak rays of light. The chalk was already fading, smudged not by the wind of the street, but by the condensation clinging to the large front windows and the frantic bustle of the previous day's customers who had leaned close to read her predictions. She'd received Soren's last letter yesterday and read it 7 times. Not because she didn't understand it the first time, but because understanding something and acting on it were different things. He'd written about legacy, about the difference between builders and fixers, about the blindness that comes from trying to solve other people's problems to avoid solving your own. And then at the end he'd written, the greatest gift we can give others is their own agency, the space to make their own choices, even the wrong ones. Especially the wrong ones. She picked up the eraser she'd brought from the cottage, a worn pink rectangle, and began. The names came off first. Eleonora. Gideon. Then Mrs. Reed and a visiting cousin. Then the couple from the village green, who'd briefly seemed promising. With each stroke something shifted in her chest, not quite relief, not quite sadness. A settling. Once the board was blank except for faint ghosting of former certainties, Pippa stood back and breathed. The morning was cool, with that quality of late autumn that made everything feel hushed and important. The bakery would open in 20 minutes. She had time. She pulled out new chalk, pastels in warm soft colors, and began. Community Connector, she wrote in the middle, the letters flowing larger and more thoughtful than she typically managed. Below that she sketched a simple design, not hearts entangled together but hands reaching toward each other from different directions. Not forcing connection so much as offering it. Making space for it. And then, below the design, she began to list. Needs dog walking buddy for Tuesdays and Fridays, read the first entry. Looking for chess partner, beginner friendly, came next. Wants to start a book club, mysteries preferred. Has extra vegetables from garden, trading for canned goods. Seeking hiking companion for weekend walks. Each entry was a small door instead of a wall. The chalk dust coated her fingers pink and gold and soft blue as she worked. She smiled, not the bright manic smile of someone convinced they were solving the world's problems. This smile was quieter. Genuine. As she finished the final entry, the sun crested the corner of the bakery building, turning the window glass luminous and casting amber light across the hardwood floors. She stepped back from the wall, her heels clicking on the hardwood as she surveyed the new design. Margot was already behind the counter, the smell of cooling cinnamon rolls filling the room, and for the first time in weeks Pippa didn't feel the urge to revise it, to add something, to fix any shortcoming. It was enough. Pippa then heard the voices. Not loud. Not arguing. Just voices, practical and measured, coming from the direction of the hardware store across the street. Pippa's instinct was immediate and nearly irresistible, to turn, to look, to locate the source. She felt it rising like a tide. But she forced herself to move toward the counter, toward Margot and the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning. She set down her apron and tried to focus on the task at hand, counting the register, checking inventory, the small rituals that grounded her. When Margot moved to the front window to flip the open sign, Pippa allowed herself to turn. Just to check. Eleonora and Gideon stood near the hardware store's entrance, 3 feet apart. Not close. Not warm. But they angled toward each other, not rigidly away. Eleonora held the Autumn Festival flyer. Gideon pointed at something on it, his expression focused. They were discussing the festival, Pippa realized. Something practical and ordinary. Watching them, truly watching, not trying to engineer or direct, Pippa felt something bloom in her chest. It wasn't the dramatic reconciliation she might have scripted. No embraces, no tears. Just Eleonora and Gideon, angled toward each other, discussing a flyer. That felt more true than anything her matchmaking board had produced. Gideon said something, and Eleonora's mouth curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough. Pippa turned away from the window before she could see more. There was something sacred about letting it exist without her witness, without her annotation, without her need to make meaning of it. The bell above the door chimed as the first customer of the day arrived, Mrs. Henderson, who came in every Tuesday for a butter croissant and black coffee. Pippa greeted her with genuine warmth, not the slightly frantic energy she'd been channeling before. When Mrs. Henderson asked if she was feeling all right, Pippa realized she was. "I'm better than I expected to be," she said honestly. Mrs. Henderson paused while removing her gloves, a woman in her 70s with kind eyes and reading glasses on a beaded chain. "I saw you through the window this morning before sunrise. I couldn't sleep, and I saw you at that wall working with such focus," Mrs. Henderson said. "It's lovely, dear. Much lovelier than the last one. There's something wise about what you're doing." Pippa's throat tightened in a way that was pleasant. "Thank you. I'm still learning what this is supposed to be. But it feels closer to right than before." "That's usually how these things work," Mrs. Henderson said, settling onto one of the stools at the counter. "You try one way, it doesn't work, you try another, and eventually you stumble onto something that feels true. That's not failure, dear. That's life." Soren was in those words too, that same gentle insistence that the process itself was the point, that growth came through adjustment, not through being right the first time. Pippa realized with a flutter that surprised her, that she looked forward to his letters more than anything else in her week. The anticipation of seeing his precise handwriting in the cubby box had become something she noticed without quite examining, a warmth in her chest that arrived along with the envelope. She told herself it was gratitude. Gratitude for his honesty, for the way he never condescended to her hope even when he doubted it. But the warmth lingered in a way that felt like it might be something more. The rest of the morning unfolded in that easy rhythm Pippa had begun to recognize as contentment. Customers came and went. She served them with genuine attention, instead of distracted planning. She listened to their small stories, the woman whose daughter was getting married, the man whose new house was finally being completed, the elderly couple who came in most mornings just to sit and watch the world go by together. Around noon, when business had quieted, Pippa glanced at the kindness jar on the shelf. It was nearly overflowing now, notes and folded papers that people had been adding all week. Evidence that this space, this bakery, had mattered enough that they wanted to contribute to it. The community connector board dominated the far wall, its new entries catching the warm amber light of the shop. It was offering what she actually had to offer, not romance, not certainty, but community. Acknowledgement. Space. Margot came over with a fresh pot of tea, her movements familiar and comfortable. They'd fallen into their working rhythm over the weeks, and there was something nice about colleagues who understood each other without much explanation. "You look different today," Margot said, setting the pot down. "Lighter." "I feel lighter," Pippa admitted. "I think I've been carrying something I didn't need to carry." "The matchmaking?" "All of it. The certainty that I knew what people needed." Margot smiled. "I think you're becoming something different this week." After Margot returned to her work, Pippa stood alone with her thoughts and the soft sounds of the bakery settling into its afternoon rhythm. The warmth of the ovens, the gentle clink of dishes being washed, the hum of the coolers. It was all familiar now, and she'd stopped noticing how much comfort it provided. Pippa leaned against the counter, her eyes drifting back to the far wall where someone had already added a note about piano lessons. Her first instinct was to wonder who had written it, to calculate possible matches, to begin the familiar work of connection building. But she caught herself smiling at the old pattern, at its persistence. She simply felt grateful. Someone had read her board and understood what it was offering. Someone had added their own small request for community. That was enough. She had Soren's letters at home, waiting in a drawer lined with tissue paper. She would write back tonight, tell him about the new board, about the moment she'd witnessed and then chosen not to interfere with, about the growing sense that perhaps her real gift wasn't matchmaking at all, but simply the consistent presence of someone who believed in connection's possibility. But before then, there were customers to serve and a bread oven that needed checking. There was the ordinary, undramatic work of being present in her community, one small gesture and one clear-eyed choice at a time. In the fading afternoon light, with the smell of baking bread rising around her like a benediction, Pippa found that this quiet, grounded contentment was what she'd been looking for all along.
Chapter 10. 1 week before Christmas, and the temporary banner hanging above the bakery door looked like something a child might have made, though that was unfair. Pippa had painted it with care. Soren could see that much from where he stood on the sidewalk, his eyes tracking the cream cloth as it sagged against its thumbtacks. Then his gaze drifted lower, past the banner and through the fogged window glass, catching on the far wall inside the shop. There, the pink hearts of her old matchmaking board were gone, replaced by the soft pastels of the community connector. One was a flimsy sign for the world, the other was the real living heartbeat of the room. It was the physical proof of the agency she'd written about, the shift from fixing to simply seeing. He'd come to town for supplies, wood stain, linseed oil, carving chisels. Routine errands. But stopping outside this particular storefront had become routine too, a detour that added 5 minutes to his journey home. He'd told himself it was to check on the bakery. The truth was more complicated, tangled up with letters and exchanges, and the strange sensation of being needed in a way that had nothing to do with commissions or obligations. The banner rippled in the wind. One corner folded inward, and Soren frowned at the sight. He reached up and steadied it with one hand. The linen was cold even through his gloves, slightly damp from the night's frost. He held it longer than necessary, aware he was being inefficient, that he could simply walk away and let the banner sag again. But the part of him that had softened since reading Pippa's letters didn't want to leave it that way. When he released it, the banner held firm. Pippa had written about community 3 times in her recent letters. Not directly, but woven through her observations, how Mrs. Reed now took her afternoon coffee at the bakery specifically to see who else might stop by, how Gideon had begun helping move chairs between spaces without being asked, how providing a gathering place seemed to reshape something in people's posture, their willingness to stay. Her words painted a picture of something fundamental shifting in Oakhaven, something frozen beginning to thaw. He recognized the impulse because he felt it too, the slow recognition that isolation, which had once felt like choice, was beginning to feel like a mistake. Legacy isn't about grand things, she'd written in one letter, but about the permanent marks we leave. The places people choose to return to. The evidence that we existed, that we cared enough to make something. He'd read that passage 3 times. The banner fluttered again. Soren made a decision, the kind that came fully formed, no deliberation required. He turned from the window and continued toward the hardware store, his mind already calculating what he needed. The piece was waiting for him in the back corner of Ashford's timber yard, where they kept the reclaimed wood. He'd walked past it 2 months ago and noted it immediately. Old oak, thick and substantial, the grain showing its history in deep amber striations. It had come from a barn outside the county, harvested when the structure was pulled down. Nail holes still visible. A long scratch down one edge from years of friction, something dragged past it repeatedly. Perfect. Soren arranged for the piece to be set aside and delivered to his workshop. The cost was reasonable, the delivery straightforward. He drove home in the growing darkness. The workshop was cold when he arrived. He'd let the fire die down that morning. Now he rebuilt it slowly, methodically, laying kindling and opening the damper. The familiar ritual of creating heat, finding the dry tinder, arranging the wood in the precise angle that allowed air to feed the flame, felt different today. More purposeful. He was building heat not just for himself, but for the wood that would soon require his attention, for the project that had begun to matter in ways he couldn't articulate. While the flames caught and grew, orange and yellow eating across the kindling with a sound like rain on paper, he examined the block of oak as the delivery man had left it, wrapped in brown paper and craft string, resting on his main work table like a gift waiting to be opened. The weight of it settled into his palms, his wood, the timber he'd chosen and paid for and transported with his own hands. This wasn't a commission. This was something else. Something more honest. The fire crackled behind him, and the workshop began to warm in that slow, generous way that only real flame provides. He didn't unwrap it immediately. Instead, he made coffee, washed his hands, settled into the chair by the growing fire. He thought about Pippa's handwriting, the way her letters had taken on a confidence they hadn't possessed in those first careful exchanges. He thought about the mistletoe mixer, about what it had become through her determination to pivot, to see failure not as an ending, but as a redirection. The fire had reached its full warmth when he finally stood and approached the table. The oak revealed itself gradually as he unwrapped it. The paper fell away in sections, releasing a smell that was part soil, part time, part something ancestral. The wood underneath was heavier than he remembered, dense with purpose. He ran his fingers along the edges, feeling the slight roughness where it had been cut. The design was already in his mind. Simple lines, the kind that looked effortless until you understood the geometry required to balance them. The mistletoe mixer, in a font suggesting tradition without ornament. Letters that would need to be carved deep enough to cast small shadows, to show the grain underneath. He pulled out charcoal and a length of butcher paper. Sketched. Erased. Sketched again. The first 3 attempts felt too formal, too heavy-handed. The fourth began to settle into something matching the character of the space itself, friendly but dignified, crafted but not fussy. By the time midnight passed into early morning, Soren had a design that satisfied him. He transferred it to the oak using carbon paper, his movements precise, the lines appearing on the wood like evidence this was meant to be. The carving began the next day. He worked without hurrying, letting the chisels guide him into the grain. The wood was cooperative, eager to yield the shape he'd imagined. Careful taps of the mallet, systematic removal of material, the steady emergence of letters from blank surface. The smell of fresh-cut oak filled the workshop, that clean woody scent unlike sawdust, more alive, more immediate. His hands knew this work. They fell into the familiar rhythm of pressure and release, angle and depth. The part of his mind that held worry, that catalogued failures, could rest while his hands engaged with the physical truth of the material. Clarity came from this kind of labor, from the small certainties that accumulate. By late afternoon, the outline was complete. The letters sat clean and sharp, ready for the next phase. Soren set down his tools and stepped back, wiping his forehead with his wrist. He could see it already, the sign mounted above the bakery door, the oak darkened by weather and time, the cranberry red paint he'd already selected sitting in a can in his supply cabinet. How it would outlast the temporary banner. The permanence of it. Standing there in the sawdust-covered workshop, he realized this act of creating felt completely separate from what he'd made before. Commissions that sustained him for years carried the weight of transaction. This carried something else. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it felt like breath after holding it too long. That night, after the fire had burned down to embers, Soren stood on the ladder and reached for the highest shelf. The flawed dovetail box sat exactly where it had sat for 5 years, prominent, unavoidable, a constant reminder of the things that could be destroyed by careless hands or broken trust. He'd looked at that box countless times. Studied how the walnut had aged, how the defective joint had become more pronounced as the wood shifted and settled. Masterwork made flawed, proof that even the most careful craftsman could fail. His hand closed around it. The weight was less than he expected. That surprised him, even after all this time. He'd enlarged it in his mind, given it dimensions it didn't possess. Soren climbed down from the ladder with the box held against his chest. He went to the small walnut dresser that occupied the corner near his sleeping area and opened the bottom drawer, the one he used for things he didn't need but couldn't discard. Old receipts, a letter from his mother he'd never answered, photographs from before. He placed the flawed dovetail box there, among the other ghosts of his past, and closed the drawer. The action was so simple that its weight took a moment to register. A hand releasing the box into darkness, the soft slide of wood against wood as the drawer returned to its frame. The drawer fit against the dresser with a decisive click. Soren stood in his workshop as the embers of the fire glowed orange in the darkness. Tomorrow he would sand the sign, prepare the wood for its final finish. Tomorrow he would begin the careful painting that would make those carved letters come alive in cranberry red. But tonight he stood in the familiar space and felt something unfold inside him that he'd been holding tight for years. It felt like possibility. It felt like purpose. It felt like the deliberate choice that comes from knowing exactly why you're making it. The workshop around him seemed to settle into the knowledge too, the tools and scraps and dust motes catching the fading light. Outside, the winter night pressed against the windows. Inside, Soren allowed himself to believe that whatever came next, he was ready to meet it.
Chapter 11. 2 days before Christmas Eve, the community connector board was covered in ribbon. Pippa stood before it on the morning of December 23rd, surrounded by craft envelopes, printed cards, and the organized chaos that had become her signature. The mistletoe mixer's kitchen was closed for the day. She'd given her staff explicit instructions not to arrive until noon, and she'd claimed the whole space for what she privately called Operation Christmas Community Connection version 2.0 Do Not Fail. She didn't have to write that subtitle on anything, but she thought it every time her eyes landed on the board. This was different from before. That mantra had sustained her for 3 weeks, ever since the idea crystallized in her mind like frost on a window. Not romantic. Not lovers, not fated pairs, not the matchmaking that had nearly destroyed the festival's goodwill and her credibility in one spectacular afternoon. This was about friendship. Real, honest friendship, uncomplicated, no romantic dependency. She'd learned the difference the hard way. The community connector board had become her tool for understanding this. Months of collecting wishes, dreams, and interests had given her a map of the town's inner landscape. She knew that Marcus, who worked at the hardware store, had written "Someone to teach me to knit, no judgment," in shy handwriting. She knew that elderly Mrs. Reed had mentioned missing someone to debate book choices with. She knew that Jamie from the post office had scribbled a wish about learning woodworking basics, and that, well, that one made her pause. She'd known exactly the right person for it, and the thought lodged in her throat like a swallowed stone. She moved forward anyway. People could want multiple friendships. Wisdom meant acknowledging her limits while hoping for good outcomes. Sometimes you had to put yourself out there even if your pulse raced. Pippa selected another envelope from her stack and checked her list. The craft paper was soft under her fingertips, already addressed in her best calligraphy. Inside was a printed card explaining the exchange. A Christmas community connection is someone you've walked past a dozen times, or a neighbor you've known for years but never truly understood. This Christmas, you're invited to step beyond the surface and exchange a small token of friendship with someone new. You've been paired not for romance, but because of a shared interest or a common thread that our community noticed in your stories. Give a gift that reflects a neighbor's hobby. Share an honest conversation that goes deeper than the weather. You might just find that a kindred spirit has been standing right beside you all along. The envelope for Marcus held a card with Mrs. Reed's name, and a note about her love of books and occasional solitude. For Mrs. Reed, a card about Marcus's quiet cleverness and his desire to create. Jamie's envelope came with details about woodworking interests, and a gift certificate to the specialty lumber yard 2 towns over. Each pairing had been made with deliberate care. This was different. This had to be. Pippa set down her pen and pressed her palms to her eyes. The kitchen held the faint smell of yesterday's cinnamon rolls. She'd made a test batch of a new recipe, something spiced and warm that might become her signature holiday treat. The smell should have comforted her. Instead, it felt like evidence of someone assuming there would be a tomorrow, as if destroying everyone's faith in her judgment was forgivable. Doubt still came, usually late at night. What if this was matchmaking with a better excuse? What if she was overstepping? What if she was still the naive woman who'd tried to force Eleonora and Gideon together? But the community connector board itself had transformed the town. The knitting circle had emerged. Mrs. Okafor had started a cooking club. Casual friendships had bloomed not because Pippa had orchestrated them, but because she'd created space for people to be seen and known. The kindest thing you could do was say, "I notice you. I see something in you that I think someone else would value. Would you be brave enough to find out?" Her pulse quickened as she placed the last envelope in the velvet-lined basket. 22 pairs. 22 chances to get it right. The morning stretched toward afternoon. Pippa arranged the envelopes according to the distribution plan. Some would be handed out at the bakery to regular customers. Others would be mailed with carefully neutral return addresses. Still, others would be left anonymously on doorsteps. The mystery would be part of the magic, she decided. People loved a mystery. People loved feeling chosen. By 3 o'clock, when her staff arrived, the groundwork was done. Pippa had moved the community connector board to a prominent position, adding silver ribbon and paper stars. She'd triple-checked the pairings and drafted a press release for the community newsletter, casual enough to not advertise that Pippa Hawthorne was orchestrating anything. The kindness jar overflowed. She'd needed a second jar to hold all the notes people had written, small kindnesses and encouragements that spilled over as evidence of real transformation. As Margot tied on her apron, she mentioned seeing Gideon and Eleonora near the hardware store. They were helping each other carry in a shipment. Actually talking. Not the civil exchange you see at town council meetings. They seemed comfortable. Pippa paused mid-frost, her piping bag suspended. Something in her chest shifted. The thaw was deeper than she'd realized. The mistletoe mixer filled with afternoon sounds, the hiss of the espresso machine, the chime of the door, gentle jazz from the corner speakers. Pippa moved through her work with meditative focus, decorating a gingerbread house cake, frosting sugar cookies shaped like mittens and bells, refilling the display case with shortbread studded with cranberry. The work required no thought. Her mind, that afternoon, was elsewhere entirely. It was in the study of her cottage, where she'd left a blank piece of paper on her desk. She hadn't written to Soren in 4 days, deliberately. She'd been waiting for the Christmas community connection plan to feel solid enough to share. This letter would be different. An invitation. Please come. At 6:47 p.m., as she locked up the bakery, Pippa drove home through streets glittering with Christmas lights. The December air turned crisp. Her cottage waited, golden lit, and she let herself in with the ritual that had become familiar. The study was exactly as she'd left it. The oil lamp threw warm glow across the desk. She'd restocked the writing paper, cream-colored sheets with a faint holly watermark, bought weeks ago without examining why. Her favorite pen waited, its worn grip shaped to her fingers. Pippa sat down without hesitation. Dear Soren. I hope you're well. I hope you've been warm. The temperature has dropped, winter insists on itself now. You understand the pull of hot tea in quiet rooms. I'm writing because I've done something I'm terrified of. Again. You know me well enough to understand that I have a tendency to orchestrate, to arrange, to believe I can see connections others miss. You've challenged this tendency, even as you've supported my better impulses. But I've learned something. There's a difference between imposing connection and inviting it. Between deciding for people and creating space for them to decide. I've created what I'm calling a Christmas community connection. Please don't laugh, the name is ridiculous, but the idea matters. I've paired people from our community, based on shared interests and complementary personalities. But I'm not telling them why. I'm not saying, I believe you're fated to be friends. I'm saying, I think you might like this person, and here's a gift and an invitation to find out. Less control. More hope. The exchange begins on Christmas Eve, at the festival finale. I'm nervous. You know what happened the last time I tried to arrange people's connections. But I feel different about this. I've learned something. If I don't put myself out there, if I don't take the risk again, I'm letting one failure define me forever. So here's what I'm asking. Please come to the Winter Wishes Festival on Christmas Eve. I want you there at 7 o'clock. Over the months we've been writing, you've become the person I trust most. You've listened to my ideas, challenged the ones that mattered, supported the ones worth supporting. You've reminded me who I am when I was lost. More than anything, I want to meet you. I want to know the face of the person whose words have become my compass. I've wondered about this, wondered if your face will match the voice I've imagined, wondered if I'd recognize you by the shape of your hands, whether they're as sure as your words. I wonder if this makes me foolish. But I'm wondering anyway. Real life is never as neat as the story you tell about it. But whatever happens, I want you present. The letter I'm enclosing will be my last before the festival. After Christmas Eve, maybe we won't need letters. Maybe we'll take our friendship into different forms. I want to find out with you. Come if you can. I'm hoping so hard it frightens me. Yours in hope and honest nervousness. Pippa. P.S. I'm making a new holiday recipe for the festival. Cinnamon rolls with cardamom and orange zest. I hope you'll try one. I hope I get to watch your face when you taste it. That might be the whole point of this letter. That simple, ordinary hope. Pippa read it through once, her throat tight. It was earnest, vulnerable, everything she felt. She sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to Soren's post office box, and drove it to the mailbox herself. Standing in the blue glow of the mail slot, she thought about the Christmas community connection pairs she'd arranged. 22 opportunities for people to surprise themselves and each other. 22 tiny rebellions against isolation. She was no different from them. She was pairing herself with someone in hope, waiting to see if the connection would hold. But this felt different, a trembling in her chest that had nothing to do with the friendship she'd successfully arranged for others. This was something she had no name for yet, something that had crept in slowly through ink and November, and the terrible, wonderful knowledge that she was placing her heart in someone's hands before she'd ever met them. The wind was cold on her face. 2 days until Christmas Eve. 2 days until she'd know whether her pen pal would show up. 2 days until she'd meet Soren and discover what it felt like to know someone in all the ways that mattered. She drove home through the Christmas lights, her hand steady on the wheel, her heart trembling. That simple, ordinary hope would have to be enough.
Chapter 12. Christmas Eve morning, the letter arrived slipped under the workshop door in a cream envelope. Soren recognized the handwriting before opening it. 3 weeks of correspondence had made him fluent in every curve and flourish. He set down his carving tools. He just finished the bakery sign, the last curling edge of the M in mistletoe, and the work was fresh enough that shavings still curled on his bench like tiny scrolls. The piece lay complete and luminous under afternoon light. The reclaimed oak had aged to soft honey brown, and the letters gleamed with cranberry red paint, the color still wet enough that he could smell its faint chemical brightness. He sat down on the edge of his workbench before opening it. His fingers had begun to tremble, something that rarely happened, a physical response he recognized from years of careful control. But this was different. This wasn't the tremor of concentration, or the nerves of perfectionism. This was her. This was the terrifying knowledge that somewhere in these lines, Pippa had written his name, had thought of him, had given voice to something he'd only admitted to himself in the dark hours of his workshop. The workshop held its breath, dust motes suspended in winter light, fire crackling. This moment was a hinge. On one side, the man he'd been, careful and distant. On the other, something unknown, terrifying, something that smelled like possibility. He opened the letter. The words tumbled out in Pippa's careful handwriting, but he could hear her voice, warm, earnest, alive. She wrote about the Christmas community connection she'd organized for Christmas Eve. She explained the details, how people had signed up, how the anonymous pen pals would reveal themselves during the evening, how she'd designed the moment of meeting to be public and joyful. Then she wrote about him. I don't know who you are yet. That's the beauty, we'll find out together. But I need you to know that your letters have saved me. Quietly. You've become my closest friend, and I don't think I've told you that. Your honesty has challenged me. Your wisdom has changed how I see things. Your kindness has shown me people are better than I fear. I need you to know this before we meet, so you understand this matters. You matter. Please come to the festival. Please be there on Christmas Eve. Please let me meet you properly. The letter continued with practical details about timing and location. What settled into his chest was simpler: someone needed him. Not the worker for hire, the merchant of usefulness. The him that had been slowly returning to the world through these letters. Soren looked at the sign on his workbench. He'd carved this beautiful thing without knowing exactly why. The work had felt necessary, like answering a call he didn't understand. Less than a week ago he'd woken with an image in his mind, the mistletoe mixer spelled in elegant capitals, letters clean and timeless. He'd sketched it that same morning, purchased the wood and set himself to the work. Every stroke of the gouge had felt like building. A promise. A statement. A permanent declaration that beauty mattered, that hospitality mattered, that Pippa's vision mattered enough to spend hours perfecting. He'd done it without her asking, without knowing she would ever see it. The empty shelf across the workbench caught his eye. That was where the flawed dovetail box had lived for years, a constant reminder of failure. He'd moved it into a drawer several days ago. He hadn't wanted to throw it away. Some part of him wasn't ready to declare that version of himself dead, but he hadn't wanted to see it. The contrast struck him now. There was his past, a perfect box made for someone who never wanted it. A thing created in isolation, without love, without purpose beyond proving something to himself. And there was his present, this sign, this beautiful oak and cranberry red, made in service of someone else's joy. Made in connection. He read the letter again. Then a third time. The request was simple and impossible. Come to the festival. Be in public. Be recognized. Break the walls he'd maintained so long, they felt like the architecture of who he was. Walk into a room full of people who knew his reputation for absence, for silence. But it was for Pippa. The word friend no longer contained what she'd become, not after these weeks of letters had stripped away his defenses, not when the thought of her face made his hands unsteady, not when she'd become the person he most wanted to know and the one he was most terrified to disappoint. He knew exactly who she was. The mystery had long since dissolved into the visceral reality of her face and her voice, which he had observed from the sidewalk while watching her move through the bakery with undeterred purpose. The distinctive handwriting was no longer a puzzle, but the living breath of the woman who had reached through his walls while he spent hours carving her shop's name into reclaimed oak. She wasn't just anyone in Oakhaven, she was Pippa, the person who had become his closest friend while he remained a ghost in the shadows. What mattered now was that she had opened herself to him completely in those letters, and now she was opening the door wider, asking him to finally step through it and be seen. The fear was enormous. It lived in his chest like something with weight and teeth. What if the town was unwelcoming? What if they remembered why he'd withdrawn? What if his return looked pathetic? But underneath the fear was something else. Someone had trusted him with their honesty. Someone had given him friendship without conditions, without knowing his face or his reputation. Someone had asked him to come, and the ask was rooted in care. That was worth being terrified for. Soren stood and walked to the sign on his workbench, placing his palm flat against it. The wood was still slightly tacky from the paint. The edges of the letters were crisp and true. He'd done this work with his whole attention, his whole skill. Every curve was intentional. Every detail done not because it was required, but because it deserved to be done well. This sign was him. This was what he could offer the world. He looked at the date on Pippa's letter. Christmas Eve. That was 3 days away. 3 days to wrap the sign, choose what to wear, remember what it felt like to be in a room with people. He could do this. The decision settled over him like something inevitable, a stone dropping into still water. Not easy. Not without doubt. But certain. He would go to the festival, carry the sign, walk into the mistletoe mixer on Christmas Eve and let himself be known. He would meet Pippa. The thought made his fingers tremble. He sat down on the workshop stool, suddenly uncertain his legs would hold him. This was real. This was happening. He was about to step into the life he'd been hiding from, and he was going to do it because someone had asked him to. The fear that gripped him wasn't only about the crowd or the public exposure, it was the deeper terror of meeting her and discovering whether the pull he'd felt on paper, sentence by sentence, could possibly survive in the flesh, in the moment when she saw his face and he saw hers, and all the letters fell away. Soren pulled out a roll of brown paper. He worked carefully, wrapping the sign as tenderly as something fragile. Each movement was deliberate. Fold. Crease. Secure. His fingers had done this hundreds of times, wrapping pieces for delivery, protecting wood from weather, but this felt different. Sacred almost. He moved slowly, letting the work anchor him. When he finished, he had a neat rectangular package tied with twine. The knot was simple, the paper smooth. It didn't look like much. No one would know what lay inside. The hours of careful work, the salvaged wood with its history, the precise geometry of letters that would cast shadows when light hit them right. But he did. He knew exactly what was in there, proof that he could make something beautiful, proof that he was capable of caring about someone else's joy, proof that he was ready to come back. He ran his fingers across the wrapped package gently. The paper was cool. Outside, the winter day was darkening early, clouds gathering. But here, in his workshop, the light held steady and the sign waited, patient, ready, complete. He set the wrapped sign against the wall near the door, where he could see it. Then he turned back to his workbench and looked at the space where the flawed dovetail box had sat. The shelf was bare now, clean. He could keep it that way, leave that drawer closed, leave that version of himself in the dark. Or he could keep it as a reminder, here was where I got stuck. Here is where I learned to unstick myself. He chose to leave it closed. The workshop was growing dark. Soren lit the oil lamps, their warm glow spreading across tools and wood. He had work he could do tonight. Repairs for Mrs. Reed, a bookcase for the library, the ordinary work that had kept him alive. But tomorrow, he would start preparing to leave it behind. Not forever. Not entirely. But for one night, he would step outside, carry something beautiful into the world, meet the person who had become his closest friend. Soren wrapped his coat around his shoulders, the heavy wool one he rarely wore, and locked the workshop for the night. The sign sat by the door, patient and ready. He would fetch it in 3 days, carry it into the festival, present it to Pippa like an offering, like a truth he'd been carving without knowing it. As he walked home through the darkening streets, the thought did not comfort him. The fear remained, sharp and present. But alongside it, for the first time in years, there was something else, a fragile, terrifying sense of purpose. He was going to go.
Chapter 13. The gazebo glowed like a promise. Pippa stood at its edge, breathing in the crisp Christmas Eve air, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest. Fresh snow dusted the cobblestones of Candlewick Commons, pristine and unmarred. The wrought iron lampposts cast warm amber light across the crowd, and somewhere above stars winked through the winter night. Evergreen garlands looped between the gazebo's white railings, tied with burgundy bows. The scent of cinnamon and pine drifted from the mulled wine station. Somewhere in the crowd someone laughed, genuine Christmas joy. Everything was beautiful. So why did her stomach feel tied in knots? Pippa smoothed the front of her emerald dress. Her palms were damp. She wiped them on her skirt, then smoothed her dress again, a nervous habit she'd tried to break weeks ago. Her fingers felt clumsy as she gripped the cards. She climbed the gazebo steps. Her heels clicked against the wood, too loud, too official. The crowd shifted, turning toward her. Their attention settled, like a weight. She dressed carefully for this moment, chose an emerald green because it matched her eyes and made her feel powerful. Now the dress felt like armor that wasn't working. This was it. The festival finale. The moment she'd planned for weeks. The Christmas community connection would prove she'd learned from her terrible matchmaking disasters. That she understood community. That 3 weeks in Candlewick Commons had changed her. People had signed up willingly. Gifts had been wrapped with care. Pairings had been arranged with thought. She'd done the work. "Hello everyone," she called out, voice only trembling slightly. The crowd quieted. "Thank you for gathering tonight. I know many of you have been curious about the Christmas community connection, and I'm thrilled to share it with you." Polite applause. Pippa's smile felt stretched too tight. "The concept is simple," she continued, pulling out her cards. "We're not looking for romantic soulmates. Instead, I've paired people who might make wonderful friends. Each pair has exchanged a gift, something I believe will resonate with their new friend. More applause. Cautious applause. Let's begin. Our first pair, Sarah Chen and Marcus Webb. Sarah bounced up from the crowd, a woman in her late 20s who'd mentioned loving indie bookstores and vintage coffee shops. Marcus followed, a man her age who'd been wanting to explore more of the town. Their gifts were exchanged. Sarah unwrapped a beautiful leather bookmark with a note about a new used bookstore 2 towns over. Marcus pulled out a vintage mug and a gift card to the coffee shop where Sarah always lingered. Sarah's face transformed. "This is perfect," she said and meant it. Her laugh was genuine. "Oh my God, I didn't even know you liked, thank you." Marcus was grinning. They fell into conversation immediately, moving to the side of the gazebo together, already making plans. Pippa's shoulders dropped an inch. Relief ran through her. Maybe this was going to work. Next pair, David and Eleanor. They came forward slowly, 2 retirees in their 70s. David unwrapped a beautiful set of woodworking chisels. Eleanor opened a collection of classic mystery novels. David's face lit up. "I've been thinking about starting a woodworking project," he said. Eleanor was already reading the back cover of her first novel. "These are wonderful," Eleanor said. She glanced at David. "You know, I've got the dining room that needs that shelf fixed." They left the gazebo together, already negotiating carpentry terms. 2 out of 2. Pippa felt the tightness ease. Maybe she really had figured this out. Maybe. Next pair, Margaret Finch and Derek Hollis. Margaret stepped forward from the crowd, a 73-year-old retired librarian. Pippa's pulse quickened. She'd paired Margaret, who loved fishing, with Derek, who'd mentioned wanting to try new hobbies. Derek handed Margaret his gift. She unwrapped it carefully, the burgundy paper falling away to reveal a deluxe knitting kit with dozens of skeins of yarn in jewel tones. Margaret's face froze mid-smile. "Oh," she said softly. "How thoughtful." Derek opened his gift, a field guide to freshwater fish and a tackle box organizer. He stared at it. "I've never fished," he said quietly. Pippa's smile cracked. "Oh. I remembered you mentioning wanting to try new things, Derek, and Margaret loves knitting, so I thought. I've fished since I was a girl. For 40 years. My late husband and I would go every weekend," Margaret interrupted gently, still holding the knitting kit like it might bite her. Margaret's face was careful. The smile of someone being kind to someone who'd made a terrible, foolish mistake. Pippa could see it clearly, kindness trying to obscure the wrongness, the polite lie layered on obvious disappointment. Pippa's mouth went dry. She gripped the gazebo railing, her knuckles whitening. When had she become so bad at listening? "Next pair," she called out, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "Patricia and Howard." Patricia bounded up from the crowd, a woman in her 50s, bubbly and energetic, who worked as an aerobics instructor. Howard shuffled forward slowly, a quiet, introverted man in his 60s who'd recently moved to Candlewick Commons to escape his former city life. Patricia unwrapped her gift and her bouncy smile faltered. A set of oil paints, brushes, and an instruction manual. She stared at it, then back at Pippa. "I mentioned I love teaching my exercise classes and I love energy, but I mean painting." Howard opened his gift, expensive noise-canceling headphones with a note about enjoying the vibrant energy of busy places, and a coupon for the town's busiest coffee shop. He looked at the headphones, then at the crowd, then back at them. His voice was very quiet. "I moved here to get away from noise. I wanted quiet. I specifically said that." The realization hit Pippa like a physical blow. She'd assumed Patricia's energy meant needing creative outlets. She'd interpreted Howard's quiet as something to fix rather than respect. She'd imposed her own narratives onto them. Pippa's voice had gone thin. She could hear it happening, couldn't stop it. "Next." But with each pair, the pattern became clearer, more terrible. A pottery class enrollment for someone who'd mentioned loving to cook. Pippa had misread their skill as restlessness. A grilling cookbook for someone in an apartment without a balcony. A journal for a chatty man. Pippa had assumed he needed introspection instead of recognizing his joy was connection. The gifts weren't just mismatched. They revealed a single assumption: Pippa had decided who people should be, then wrapped it up. The pairings were proof of the same thing. A widow and widower in a romantic setup neither had asked for. Pippa had decided their loneliness needed fixing. A teenager and elderly woman paired for inclusion, but really just Pippa imposing connection. Two people who'd had a falling out, forced to smile across a wrapped package. Pippa's fingers trembled. She gripped the cards, the rectangles cutting into her palms. Her breath shortened. The crowd's applause faded to silence. Not anger, anger would have been honest. This was kindness watching something burn. The silence of neighbors uncomfortably maintaining pleasant expressions. The silence of Christmas Eve disappointment, that particular weight of hopes dashed during the most hopeful night of the year. She pressed on mechanically. She read the names from her cards with no inflection, watched gifts be unwrapped with decreasing enthusiasm. Each exchange stripped away another layer of something she'd been building, a narrative about learning, about growth, about becoming someone better. The final pair came forward, a young man and woman who barely knew each other, both looking thoroughly confused about why they'd been paired. Their gifts were equally disastrous. A romance novel for someone who preferred mysteries. A mystery novel for someone who found them too sad. As they unwrapped their gifts in the golden gazebo light that now felt less like a promise and more like a spotlight on failure, Pippa felt something crack open inside her. She looked out at the assembled crowd. Margaret held the knitting kit at a distance, as if it might explain itself. Derek's polite nod made the tackle box organizer look like a mistake he'd carry back to his car. Patricia's smile was increasingly strained. Howard shuffled backward, embarrassed. Her neighbors and friends wore kind, pained expressions, trying so hard to hide discomfort. The Winter Wishes mailbox stood nearby, stuffed with hopes and dreams. It all felt like a lie she'd been telling herself. Her pen pal. The thought surfaced like a drowning person breaking the surface. Was he here somewhere? Had he shown up to watch this? Had he read her letter and come anyway, only to see exactly who she was, not someone who'd learned but someone who'd pretended? Not a builder of community, but someone who played at understanding, while fundamentally misunderstanding everyone. The silence pressed down harder. The beautiful Christmas Eve had become oppressive. The snow fell softer outside the gazebo's bright circle. Candlewick Commons felt impossibly quiet. She stood alone in the white gazebo, the one place she'd thought she belonged, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was evidence. This was proof. Pippa took a breath. Her voice, when she opened her mouth, came out like she was reading her own obituary. She stopped. Took another breath. The crowd waited. Watching. Waiting for her to fix this, acknowledge it, do something, anything to break the suffocating silence. Pippa felt the words forming on her tongue. The ones she'd been dreading. The ones that would change everything. She opened her mouth to speak.
Chapter 14. The silence was the worst part. Soren stood at the edge of the crowd, the hand-carved sign heavy in his grip, watching the silence settle over the Winter Wishes festival like fresh snow. Around him, people shifted their weight. Someone coughed. A child asked their mother a question that went unanswered. On the gazebo, Pippa stood motionless. Her shoulders had caved inward, as if she were trying to disappear. The Christmas community connection had ended not with drama, but with something worse: the awkward silence of failed exchanges, stilted conversations that had sputtered out, people who'd tried and fallen short. The whole grand plan, the weeks of organizing, the hope crystallized into a woman standing alone on a stage surrounded by the wreckage of good intentions. Soren had watched her throughout the festival. He'd come late, arriving as the afternoon turned toward dusk, gazebo lights flickering to life. Pippa's eyes found the clock. Her smile collapsed as the hour she'd marked passed. He'd seen her take a breath that cost her everything. He'd seen her mouth open, the way it shaped itself around words like, "I'm sorry and I quit and I'm closing the bakery." That was when Soren moved. He'd spent the last 5 years teaching himself to be small, to take up minimal space, to exist at the margins where no one would expect anything. Easier. Safer. He'd built a careful architecture of solitude, and it had served him well, predictable, uncomplicated. But watching Pippa about to surrender, something in that architecture cracked. He walked forward. The crowd parted for him. Not dramatically, but with the instinctive recoil of people encountering something they hadn't seen in a long time. Soren Vance. The woodsman. The man who disappeared into his workshop 5 years ago, and only occasionally emerged, wordless and hollow-eyed. The man people had learned not to expect. The man who was supposed to stay hidden. He climbed the gazebo steps. His boots sounded loud against the wood. Pippa's eyes found him. In them Soren saw the exact moment she didn't recognize him. Who is this? He took his place at the center of the stage, and held a neat rectangular package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He stepped toward her, the silence of the crowd pressing in like a physical weight. With fingers that trembled only slightly, he held the offering out to her. Pippa hesitated, her hazel eyes searching his face for a familiar anchor, before her hands found the twine. She pulled the knot loose, the string falling to the gazebo floor with a soft hiss. As she tore into the heavy brown paper, the scent of fresh-cut oak and wet cranberry red paint suddenly filled the air, the literal smell of the workshop she had only ever visited in her imagination. The paper fell away in sections, and the hand-carved bakery sign caught the late afternoon light. The mistletoe mixer, it said, in letters that curved like breath. Soren had begun the design less than a week ago, in his workshop's silence, thinking about invisible women and the extraordinary courage it took to keep showing up when the world didn't show up for you. Pippa's breath caught as she ran her fingers over the deep amber striations of the reclaimed oak, tracing the letters he had carved with such clean and timeless precision. Loneliness isn't about being alone, Soren said, his voice rough like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. It's about feeling invisible. And you, Pippa, you refuse to let me stay that way. He paused. Pippa's face had gone very still. Those are Pippa's words, Soren continued, forcing the words out one at a time. From a letter. A letter she wrote to someone she thought was a stranger, pouring her heart into envelopes addressed to the Winter Wishes Letter Exchange. He set the sign down on the gazebo railing. His fingers trembled too much to hold it. She wrote about feeling unseen in a town that used to be her home. About the loneliness of trying to build something beautiful when everyone around you is determined to build nothing. The crowd was entirely silent. Even the children had stopped moving. And I wrote back, Soren said. He took a breath. I told her something I've been learning slowly, over 5 years of being very good at being invisible myself. The cure for invisibility isn't a grand gesture. It's not a perfect moment or a cinematic revelation. He paused, gathering himself. It's someone simply choosing to see you. Even when you're scared. Even when you're taking up space in ways that feel unwelcome. Someone saying, I see what you're doing. I'm here. You matter. He let that settle. His shoulders were tight. Every word cost him something. I know this because I'm your pen pal, Pippa. His voice cracked on her name. He cleared his throat, continued. And you saw me. You wrote to me like I was a real person with things worth saying. You changed how I understood my own loneliness. I'm standing here to tell you all. He turned, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled faces of Oakhaven, his legs wanting very much to carry him off this stage. What Pippa Hawthorne has actually done. His fingers gripped the gazebo railing to stay upright. She opened a bakery in a town that had forgotten how to gather. She created a bulletin board where people could connect, and you know what happened. Marcus Holloway found walking partners. The book club was born, the one that's meeting again after 8 years. Mrs. Reed met the people she needed. The town started talking to itself again. Not perfectly. Not without awkwardness. But we started choosing each other because one person was stubborn enough, foolish enough, and brave enough to keep reaching out until we reached back. He picked up the sign. His fingers were steadier now, Or perhaps he'd simply run out of the luxury of caution. I spent 5 years in my workshop because I believed I was a lost cause. A man too broken to be part of anything. But I carved this sign because someone convinced me, through her absolute refusal to accept my invisibility, that even the most stubborn recluse in Oakhaven could be seen, could matter, could be part of something. His voice tightened, almost cracking, but he pushed through. She was right. The gazebo suddenly felt very small with all the eyes in it. Then Eleonora stepped forward. Soren hadn't known she was there, but of course she was. He watched as Eleonora Finch climbed the gazebo steps, her canvas work pants and steel-toed boots at odds with the festive evening, her spine straight as a plumb line. Behind her, moving with careful composure, smoothing the front of his cashmere sweater, came Gideon Croft. The two business rivals stood side by side, and the crowd stirred with quiet surprise. Soren had heard the stories, the Cold War across the town square, years of pointed silence between Finch's fine fittings and the modern hearth. But here they were. Together. "Pippa convinced me," Eleonora said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to, "that this town has a history worth protecting and a future worth building. That tradition doesn't mean standing still." She glanced sideways at Gideon, and something passed between them that looked like grudging respect. "She also showed me that the people I was most determined to shut out might be the ones worth listening to." Gideon cleared his throat. "We're co-sponsoring an initiative," he said, his measured voice gaining warmth. "Shop Oakhaven. Combining the historical knowledge of our established businesses with fresh marketing and community outreach. Eleonora knows every family that's built this town. I know how to help the world find it. Together, we can bring people here while honoring what Oakhaven has always been." It wasn't a grand gesture. But it was an opening. The applause started quietly. Marcus began clapping steadily, then the owner of the quilting shop and the librarian. People Soren recognized from his long vigils outside the window, from his quiet observations through the fogged glass of the bakery, and from weeks of watching small connections and quiet conversations be stitched back into the fabric of a town that had almost forgotten how to be a town. It built slowly. Not a roar, but a sustained, genuine recognition. The kind of applause that sounds like "yes, and we understand, and we're ready to try." Soren watched Pippa's face throughout it all. He saw the moment she stopped looking like she wanted to disappear. Her shoulders came back up. Confusion gave way to recognition, and recognition gave way to something that made her entire face shift like sunrise. Her eyes found his, and they held. No dramatics. No grand moment. Just a woman looking at a man and seeing him, truly seeing him, in the same way he'd been seeing her for weeks. The recognition hit them both at once. This wasn't just understanding that she'd been visible all along. This was the moment when visibility became something else entirely. This was the moment when the woman on paper became real, and the man in the shadows became willing to step into the light. This was the moment before everything changed. His breath caught. The crowd noise, which had filled the entire evening, suddenly fell away. There was only Pippa and the clarity of what they'd built on paper, the weight of it, the reality of it. The knowledge passing between them like current. "I've been writing to you. I know you. And now." She laughed. Not a loud laugh, but a real one, the kind that comes from something breaking open inside and finding light. Her hand came up to her chest as if she couldn't quite catch her breath. And Soren, standing in front of the entire town of Oakhaven, did something he hadn't done in years. He smiled, truly smiled, full and unguarded, the smile that had been waiting behind 5 years of silence. Just a moment, but enough. Visible only to someone looking, visible only to her. And she was looking. The applause continued. The lights above the gazebo seemed brighter now, holding back the darkness of the forest and the night. Around them, people began to talk. Real conversations, enthusiastic conversations, conversations that built on what Pippa had started and what Eleonora and Gideon had just committed to continuing. Soren descended the gazebo steps, his chest tight with the raw effort of his speech. He didn't run, but he moved with purpose back toward the edge of the crowd, needing the familiar safety of the shadows. He still held the sign, and he set it down carefully on the bakery's festival table, the one covered in cream-colored tissue paper and the remnants of her Christmas community connection. He positioned it so the cranberry-red letters caught the golden light of the lanterns, a silent promise left exactly where he knew she would find it. He watched from the periphery as Pippa finally stepped down from the gazebo, her eyes moving straight to the oak grain he had salvaged for her, his gift finally home in the place where she built beautiful things. He'd spoken more words in the last 5 minutes than in 5 months. His throat felt raw, his legs uncertain. He was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. But as he turned back one more time and watched Pippa stepping down from the gazebo with new lightness, watched people approaching her with genuine warmth instead of polite distance, watched Oakhaven beginning to believe in itself again, Soren thought that perhaps there were some things worth the cost of exposure. Some moments worth breaking your own careful architecture for. He'd spent 5 years learning that invisibility was safer than sight. It took one woman's refusal to accept that logic to teach him otherwise. The Winter Wishes Festival continued around them, bright and full of sudden possibility. And Soren Vance, for the first time in a long time, stayed in the light instead of retreating to the shadows. He didn't draw attention to himself. He simply remained present, allowed himself to be witnessed. As the evening wore on and the crowd continued its gentle celebrations, Soren found himself watching Pippa from across the gazebo, the way she moved through conversations, the way people gravitated toward her. And he let himself acknowledge what his careful architecture had been built to deny: this wasn't friendship. Or not only friendship. This was something that had been growing through every letter, every carefully chosen word, every moment of being truly seen by another person. This was a pull he didn't have words for yet. A warmth that had nothing to do with the festival lights and everything to do with the woman who had insisted he mattered. He didn't name it. Not yet. But he stopped pretending it was anything less than what it was, the beginning of something that had the potential to reshape him entirely. In the distance, the forest waited. The woods were still his sanctuary. But they were no longer his prison. And that made all the difference.
Chapter 15. The mistletoe mixer smelled like Christmas morning, cinnamon and clove, butter and sugar caramelizing in the ovens, the pine garland Pippa had woven around the doorframe the night before. Fresh snow pressed against the front windows, pristine and unmarked, and the early light had that particular quality it held only on Christmas Day: soft, forgiving, golden. Pippa stood behind the counter, watching the hand-carved sign catch sun. The cranberry-red letters sat bold against the weathered oak: Soren's salvaged wood, his planing, his work. The mistletoe mixer, it read, and below that, in smaller letters, a place to find warmth and connection. She'd cried a little when she'd first seen it last night, after the town had wound down, and she'd hung it on the beam above the front door, where it now stood watch over the commons. She wasn't tired, despite being awake since 4 in the morning. There was a different kind of energy that came with opening on Christmas. Not the frantic, anxious energy of trying to prove something, but the quiet, purposeful energy of knowing this place mattered. That it would be here tomorrow, and the day after. Not as an experiment or a temporary project, but as a permanent part of Oakhaven. The first customers arrived at 8 o'clock. That would be Mrs. Reed and her grandson, who came every Saturday morning without fail. This morning they came because it was Christmas, and they wanted to be here. Pippa watched through the kitchen pass as the little boy pressed his nose against the counter, choosing between a gingerbread star and a candy cane cookie, with the gravity of someone making a life-altering decision. "The star," Mrs. Reed advised gently. "Save the candy cane for later, when you're home." Pippa wrapped both and refused payment for the second one. Some things couldn't be transactions. Some things were simply goodness moving outward into the world, waiting for more goodness to move back. She had baked the batch specifically for today, piping red and white decorations onto each cookie, imagining the hands that would hold them. Mrs. Reed's grandson would eat his star slowly. Someone's child would photograph theirs before eating. An elderly customer would carry one to a neighbor who'd spent Christmas alone, now no longer solitary, thanks to the bulletin board and the small work of connection. By 9 o'clock, the small shop was warm with bodies and conversation. The community connector board, which had evolved beautifully from her original matchmaking dreams into something far better, was crowded with flyers and handwritten notes. A single mother seeking childcare referrals. A retired carpenter offering to teach basic woodworking to neighborhood kids. Someone looking for a reading buddy. Someone advertising a free piano lesson. A family planning a community dinner in January. It was the visible heartbeat of something real and living, and far better than she could have orchestrated. He arrived at 10:30, brushing snow from his shoulders as he stepped through the door. He was wearing the same dark sweater he'd worn at the festival, the one that made his eyes seem deeper, darker. His hair had that just combed appearance that suggested he'd made an effort. Pippa's stomach did a flip, a proper flip, the kind she'd been feeling since last night when he'd smiled at her across the gazebo. The romantic flutter she'd been denying for weeks, now impossible to deny. It was warm and easy and electric all at once. The recognition of someone who truly knew you, combined with the discovery of seeing him differently now. Knowing him differently. "Morning," he said, and his eyes found hers across the busy shop with the familiarity that only came from months of written words and honest thoughts shared in secret. But there was something new there too, a question, a warmth, a deliberate choice to look at her and not look away. "Morning." She smiled. "Hot cocoa?" He nodded, and she watched as he navigated through the cluster of customers with the careful awareness of someone who preferred the periphery, but had learned to move through crowds without vanishing. He settled onto one of the stools at the counter, the one that had become unofficially his over the past few days, and she prepared his drink without asking. She already knew, extra marshmallows, a touch of real vanilla, the temperature of gentle warmth rather than scalding heat. They didn't speak while she worked, and the silence was comfortable, not yet something deeper. Not until she'd settled beside him with her own mug, warming her fingers on the ceramic, before he turned to her. "I need to say something," Soren said, and his voice had that particular quietness it had held in all his letters, the kind of quiet that meant he'd thought his words carefully. "About what you wrote 3 weeks ago." Pippa's breath caught. She knew exactly which letter he meant. The one where she'd written about being afraid, she'd built something that only existed because she was there to perform it. The fear that without her constant pushing, arranging and hoping, the whole thing would collapse. The letter where you said you didn't know if any of it was real, or if you were just holding people together by sheer will. He turned his mug in his hands, not looking at her yet. "I need you to know that I knew. Not because I was brilliant or perceptive, but because I was watching. Every day. And it was real. All of it. Not because you made it real, because you let it be real. You created a space, and then you got out of the way enough to let people find each other in it." He looked at her then, and his eyes had that steady, certain quality they'd held when he emerged from the Christmas Eve crowd. "I was terrified to tell you my name. Because I thought if you knew it was me writing those things, you'd know that I was the one person who wasn't afraid of you. Who wasn't watching the magic happen around you. I was watching you happen around the magic." Pippa felt something in her throat tighten. This was the kind of honesty that lived only on paper, or so she'd thought. The kind that required the safety of distance. "I walked through that crowd," she heard herself say, "because I needed to know if you meant what you'd written. If that person I'd been talking to all those weeks was real. And when you looked at me, when you knew immediately." She shook her head. "That was the moment I understood that the letters weren't just advice you were giving me. They were you trying to tell me who I actually was." "Who are you?" he asked softly. "Someone who doesn't have to fix everything to make it matter," she said. "Someone who can just bake bread, open a door and trust that people will find their way through it." He smiled and it transformed his face. Not the careful, measured expression she'd become familiar with, but something full and unguarded. "That's who you always were. You just needed to know it." They sat with that for a moment, the silence between them now heavy with meaning, not light with comfort. The kind that came from two people who had stripped themselves bare on paper, and were now learning to do it with their faces, their voices, their presence. A group of college students had claimed the corner table, working on something that looked like a community service project. An elderly gentleman sat by the window, reading the paper and nursing a coffee that Pippa suspected had gone cold an hour ago. Two women who Pippa didn't recognize were deep in conversation, the kind that suggested new friendship, the kind that starts with strangers and becomes something else. "I've been thinking," Soren said after a while, and lightness had returned to his voice, "about something you mentioned months ago." "What's that?" "The woodworking workshop. For kids." He turned the mug slowly in his hands, watching the marshmallows bob. "I think I want to do it. Really do it, not just someday." Pippa felt something bright kindle in her. Yeah. There's Mrs. Reed's grandson, and I know a few other kids in the neighborhood. Nothing structured. Just teaching them how to make something with their hands. How to take a piece of wood and make it into something that matters. She thought about the sign hanging above the door, the letters he'd carved with such precision, the weeks of work that had gone into shaping that oak into something that represented this whole improbable thing they'd built. "You could use the back room here," she offered. "On Sunday afternoons maybe. Once a month to start. We could have snacks, keep it feeling like play rather than instruction." "I'd like that," he said. "A lot." Before Pippa could respond, a young voice called out from across the shop. "Miss Pippa. Miss Pippa, can we put something on the board?" It was a group of 3 teenagers, holding a handwritten flyer. Pippa excused herself from Soren and crossed the shop to meet them, curious. "We're starting a community garden in spring," one of them explained, slightly shy. "In the lot behind the community center. We wanted to see if anyone else would want to help plan it." That particular joy arrived, watching the ecosystem she'd nurtured grow its own roots. "That's wonderful. Let me post it for you." She pinned the flyer to the board, and as she did, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: the small glass jar that had sat on the community connector shelf since early autumn. The kindness jar. She'd placed it there with the instruction that people could write down acts of kindness they'd witnessed or received, a simple documentation of the quiet magic that happened in the margins of ordinary days. It was overflowing. Scraps of paper in different handwriting, different colors, spilling over the lip and gathering in a small pile beside it. She glanced back at Soren, who was watching her with that particular attentiveness. He understood, she realized. This jar full of small notes about small kindnesses was the real proof. Not the grand gestures or the orchestrated moments, but the simple accumulation of people choosing to see and acknowledge each other's goodness. She picked one note at random from the pile and unfolded it. "Someone bought my coffee when I dropped my wallet. It sounds small, but it made me feel like the world isn't entirely cold." Pippa's eyes stung. She picked another. "My neighbor helped me carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs without being asked. That's community." And another. "A stranger held the door for me when my hands were full, and she smiled like she actually saw me." She stood there holding those 3 small pieces of paper, and it struck her that this was what she'd been building toward without knowing it. Not romance, not the perfect match, but the idea that people could see each other, make each other's days lighter through the simplest gestures, that a place where people gathered could become a place where people truly connected. "You okay?" Soren had come to stand beside her, so close she could feel the warmth of him. "Yeah," she said, and she meant it completely. "I'm better than okay." They returned to the counter, and Soren helped her carefully replace the overflowing kindness jar to the shelf, adjusting it so none of the notes would scatter. As he positioned it, his hand found hers deliberately, not an accidental brush but a conscious choice. Pippa felt the spark of it immediately, bright and surprising, coupled with the deeper recognition of someone who had become essential. This was both things at once, the electricity of attraction and the profound safety of being known. A man who had written to her mind before he'd ever met her face, who had carved a sign from wood and hung her words above the door, who saw her completely. And now, standing close enough that she could feel his warmth, close enough that the space between them seemed to pulse with possibility, he was choosing her. Not as a pen pal. As something more. She turned toward him, and they were close, closer than they'd been since yesterday. close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow she'd never noticed before, the slight catch in his breathing that mirrored her own. Close enough that this wasn't friendship anymore. It was the moment before something, the held breath before the beginning. "Pippa," he said softly, and her name in his voice, spoken aloud, not written, was its own kind of revelation. For a moment, neither of them moved. The shop continued around them. The quiet chime of the door as a customer left, the hiss of the espresso machine, the soft murmur of conversations, but it all seemed very far away. This was their pocket of silence, their moment of held breath. Then Soren reached up, his hand finding the curve of her cheek with the same deliberate care he'd used when carving the sign. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and Pippa's breath caught. "I've been waiting," he said, "to do this since I saw you step down from that gazebo." "Then don't wait," she whispered. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, to pull back, but she didn't. Instead, she met him halfway. Their first kiss was quiet and tender, just a soft brush of warmth against warmth. Not desperate or dramatic. Just the simplest gesture of recognition. "I see you. I choose you. I want to know what this is." When he drew back, his forehead rested against hers for a moment, and she could feel him smiling. "That's what the letters were building toward," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed. "Exactly that." They moved through the rest of the morning with that easy familiarity, though something had shifted, deepened. Soren helped Pippa refill the coffee, learning quickly which customers took cream and which preferred it black. He talked to Mrs. Reed's grandson about the woodworking project, drawing small sketches on a napkin to show the boy what they might build together, a cutting board maybe, or a simple birdhouse. The child's face lit up with the kind of pure excitement that only children managed. But now when Pippa caught Soren's eye across the counter, there was a new language there. Not just the understanding of the letters, but the knowledge of what it felt like to be this close to him. To have chosen this. To have him choose her in return. By noon, the shop had settled into a rhythm of arrivals and departures. The community garden teenagers left with two others who'd expressed interest. The elderly gentleman finally left his cold coffee behind and walked out into the snow with a genuine smile. Two women, who'd met as strangers at the community connector board, exchanged phone numbers and made plans to start a book club. Pippa watched it all from behind the counter, one hand on the espresso machine, the other reaching for a mug to fill. This was the work. Not grand or particularly visible, but absolutely essential. The work of tending a space, of believing that good things could grow if given the right conditions. "You're happy," Soren observed, settling back onto his stool with a fresh cocoa, extra marshmallows. "I'm home," Pippa said. It was the same thing. He nodded, understanding what she meant without explanation. That was what the letters had done. They'd created a language between them that didn't require every word to be spoken. In the 3 weeks they'd written, they'd learned how to read the silences, how to understand what was meant beneath what was said. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and persistent, covering Oakhaven in white. The Christmas lights caught the pale afternoon sun, gold and green and red against the frosted windows. The hand-carved sign above the door, the mistletoe mixer, a place to find warmth and connection, gleamed in its cranberry letters, and inside the shop the ovens ticked softly, holding their warmth like a promise kept. Pippa looked around at the people she'd gathered, without trying to gather them. At the board full of hopes and requests and offerings. At Soren beside her, completely present. At the kindness jar, overflowing with evidence that people were seeing each other, reaching for each other, choosing kindness in 1,000 small ways. This was the whole story, she realized. Not the dramatic revelation or the grand gesture or the perfectly orchestrated moment. But this, the quiet morning after, when the work continued. The cinnamon and cloves still rising from the ovens. The steam from the espresso machine clouding the windows. The weight of her grandmother's recipe box on the shelf, a legacy that had become something alive and growing in the hands of a community that cared about gathering well. She picked up her mug and its warmth radiated through her palms. Beside her, Soren did the same. For a moment they simply sat together, watching the shop they'd both built in different ways. Him with his hands and his letters, her with her ovens and her open door. The community had built the rest and would continue building it, long after Christmas morning faded into ordinary days. And Pippa Hawthorne, baker, dreamer, the woman who'd learned that connection wasn't something to orchestrate but something to create space for, felt the deep, settled peace of a story that was just beginning. The beginning of a home. The beginning of a community that had learned to see itself again. The beginning of a love story that had started in letters and was now writing itself in quiet moments and held breath, and the tender certainty of being chosen. This was everything. Not in spite of each other, but because of each other. The romance and the community, the warmth of the ovens and the warmth of his hand in hers, the grandeur of Eleonora and Gideon's collaboration, and the simple miracle of two people who'd found each other through honesty and letters and the stubborn belief that invisibility didn't have to be forever. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside the mistletoe mixer, the work continued too. The baking and the gathering, the kindness accumulating in jars, the connections forming and strengthening and beginning. And at the heart of it all, two people who'd learned to see each other, who'd chosen each other, who were building something together that was both profound and ordinary, both a love story and a homecoming, both beginning and already whole. Thank you for listening to this standalone holiday romance by Roxy Winterfield. Be sure to subscribe and punch the bell to get a notification when the next seasonal novel is released.